Hey there, and welcome back. There is a particular kind of tiredness that comes at the end of a long day, the kind that settles into the shoulders and behind the eyes. And tonight, I would like to carry it away from you for a while. Most of us, lying here in the dark, have at some point wondered what it would be like to know one of the great figures of history, not as a name carved into the side of a building, not as a date to be memorized, but as a person. As someone who got cold in winter and tired at the end of a day and worried about his children. Tonight, we are going to meet a man whose name became, in half the languages of Europe, the very word for a king. He could conquer kingdoms, build a capital city out of the ruins of Rome, and gather the finest scholars of the age around his table. And yet he kept a wax writing tablet hidden beneath his pillow, so that on the nights he could not sleep, he could lie in the dark and practice, with his enormous hand, the shapes of the letters he had never been taught to write as a boy. We are going back to the 8th century, to the world of the Franks, and before our few hours together are finished, we will stand in a cold basilica in Rome on a Christmas morning in the year 800, and watch a crown come down onto a head that the man would later swear had no idea it was coming. Before we go any further into that world, I want to say something to you, here, while the lamps of his hall are still being lit and the long tables are still being laid. The story we are about to share is one that travelled, in his own lifetime, by the slow, patient work of men on horseback. A single letter taking weeks to cross the country he ruled. And I find myself wondering where this particular telling of it has reached you. Whatever corner of the world you are listening from tonight, whatever the hour is where you are, I would love for you to leave a small note below and tell me the city, the country, the time on the clock beside you. Because in the morning I read them, and there is something quietly moving about all of us, scattered across the earth, being drawn into the same firelit hall on the same night. If you find your shoulders loosening as the evening goes on, if his world begins to feel real to you, then do take a moment to subscribe, so that the next time the lamps are lit, you will be among the first to be called back. And if there is someone you think would like to fall asleep inside a story like this one, send it to them. That is all of it. Now settle yourself properly. Let the weight of the day go. Picture this. It is winter, and the night is black and bitterly cold across the low forested country between two great rivers. The kind of cold that makes the breath of horses stand white in the air. But here, in a great hall built of stone and timber, there is firelight, there is the smell of wood smoke, and of meat turning on spits, of beeswax, and of damp wool drying near the hearths. There is the low sound of many voices, and somewhere the sound of a harp. And down the length of the hall, among courtiers dressed in fine wools, and a few in precious silks from the far edges of the world, there moves a man taller than almost any other in the room. He is broad through the chest, thick in the neck, and he walks with the heavy ease of someone who has spent all his life on horseback and in the hunt. His clothes are plain, the ordinary linen and wool of his own people, and only the gold at the hilt of his sword and the jewel at the clasp of his cloak tell you that this is no ordinary Frank. This is the king, and tonight, slowly, gently, with nothing to do and nowhere to be, we are going to follow the arc of his life. From the uncertain morning of his birth to the cold January, when the world he had built was set down, finished, to wait for whatever would come after. Let us begin where he began. We do not know, with certainty, the day this man was born. This is the first thing to understand about him, and there is something almost fitting in it, that a figure who would grow so vast in the memory of the world should begin in a kind of haze, his very birthday lost. For a long time, it was simply said that he came into the world in the year 742, on the 2nd day of April. But the people who have studied his life most closely now think it more likely that he was born a little later, around the year 747, or perhaps 748. Think of that for a moment, here in the dark. We can tell you the day he died down to the hour of the morning, but the day he was born has slipped away entirely, because at the time no one thought it worth the writing down. He was not born a king, you see. He was not even born the certain heir of a king. He was the son of a powerful man in an age that did not yet know how powerful that man's family was about to become. His name, in the rough Frankish tongue of his own people, was Karl. We know him by the name the centuries gave him afterward, a name that means, quite simply, Charles the Great. We know him as Charlemagne. The world he was born into was not yet the world he would make, and to understand the man you have to first lie quietly for a while in the strange, unsettled kingdom that made him. Picture a land of great forests and slow rivers, of small timber towns and scattered farms, the old straight Roman road still running through it, but cracked now and grass-grown, the Roman buildings standing here and there in ruin, too large for anyone still living to imagine building again. This was the kingdom of the Franks, a Germanic people who in the centuries since the Roman power in the west had crumbled and gone, had spread out across the land we would now call France, and the Low Countries, and a good part of Western Germany. It was a kingdom with a strange sickness at its very heart. It had kings who did not rule, and it was ruled by men who were not kings. The royal family, the old line called the Merovingians, traced themselves back into a half-legendary past, and they wore their hair long and uncut as the sacred mark of their blood. For it was said that the power of their house lived somehow in their flowing hair. But by the time of Charlemagne's birth, these long-haired kings had dwindled to shadows of shadows. They were brought out for the ceremonies, placed on a throne, or paraded through the people in an ox-drawn cart in the old style, and then taken quietly away again and shut up on their country estates, to do nothing, to decide nothing. It'd be nothing but a name and a head of long hair. The men who truly governed, who led the armies into battle, and judged the disputes, and bent the proud nobles to their will, held a far humbler title. They were called the mayors of the palace, and the most powerful family of these mayors, the family that had seized the office and made it their own, and passed it down from father to son like a private inheritance, was the family into which Charlemagne was born. His grandfather had been one of the most famous warriors of the age. It was he who, a decade or so before Charlemagne was born, had met and turned back a raiding army that had come up out of Muslim Spain into the south of France, in a hard battle near Tours that men remembered for centuries afterward. And for that, and for the iron of his temper, he was given a name that has clung to him ever since. They called him Charles the Hammer. His father was a different sort of man, cooler, shrewder, a planner rather than a thunderbolt, a man called Pepin, who was so short in stature that history has fixed upon him forever the name Pepin, the Short. And Pepin was not content, as his fathers had been, to go on holding all the real power of the kingdom while letting some long-haired do-nothing wear the crown and the title. He wanted the name of king as well as the substance of it. But to take a crown that was not his by blood was a dangerous and almost blasphemous thing, the sort of act that could turn every other great family in the kingdom against him. So Pepin was careful. In the year 751, when Charlemagne was still a small boy underfoot in the moving court, his father sent messengers all the way to Rome, to the Pope, and put to him a single, beautifully framed question. He asked which man ought rightly to be called king, the one who held the title and did nothing, or the one who held the power and did everything. And the Pope, who in those years needed the protection of the strong Franks against the Lombards pressing on him in Italy, far more than he needed to defend some abstract principle about long-haired kings he had never met, gave Pepin exactly the answer Pepin had travelled so far to receive. The man who holds the power, said Rome, ought to hold the name, and so the deed was done. The last of the Merovingian kings was taken to a monastery, and his sacred hair, the uncut hair of his holy line, was shorn away, and he vanished from the story into the silence of the cloister. Pepin was lifted up and anointed king of the Franks with holy oil, in the manner of the kings of the Old Testament, the first Frankish king ever to be made so, and a wholly new royal house began. We call it the Carolingian house, after all the men in it who bore the name Charles, and the small boy watching his father become a king was to be its second king and its greatest. So that was the inheritance waiting for him, and it is worth understanding exactly what kind of inheritance it was, because it shaped everything. It was not an ancient throne, settled and unquestioned, the sort a boy could simply expect to fall into. It was a brand new crown, freshly and boldly taken, still warm from the taking, resting on a family that had reached up and seized it by their own strength and cunning, and would have to keep it by the same. There were other great families in the kingdom who remembered when Pepin's people had been merely first among equals. There were the old loyalties to the vanished line, still lingering in some hearts. A new dynasty is a fragile thing, and the boy grew up breathing the knowledge of that fragility, the understanding that what his grandfather and father had built could be lost. That power was not given, but held, and held only by those strong enough to keep their grip. He grew up then as the son of a self-made king in a court that never stood still. There was no capital in those years, no single city where the king sat enthroned. The whole court travelled endlessly from royal estate to royal estate, from hunting lodge to country villa, eating its way through the stored produce and the herds of one region until they were used up and then moving on to be fed by the next, dispensing justice and holding councils and receiving envoys wherever it happened to find itself. The boy would have learned to sit a horse almost before he could walk steadily on his own legs. He would have learned to hunt the boar and the stag in the forests, to handle a spear and a sword, to read the moods and the silences of the big, rough, capable men who served his father and on whom everything depended. What he did not learn, and this matters more than almost anything else about him, what he was somehow never properly taught in those restless warrior years, was how to read with any ease or how to write at all. Letters, in the world he grew up in, were the business of churchmen and clerks, not of fighting men and kings. And so there grew up, in the moving court of the new dynasty, a boy of quick and hungry intelligence, who was never given the one key that would have unlocked all the world of the written word, and who would spend the rest of his long life reaching for it, and honouring it in others, and never quite grasping it for himself. It is one of the quiet wonders of his story that the man who would do more than any other in his age to bring learning back to Europe was himself, in the deepest and most personal sense, a child of its absence. Before we go on with his life, lie still a moment longer and let yourself feel the actual texture of the world he was born into. For it was so unlike our own that we have to build it up around ourselves carefully before the rest of the story can have its proper weight. Imagine a world almost entirely without towns as we would know them. The great cities of the Roman past had shrunk to a fraction of their old size, their populations gone, grass growing in their forums, their aqueducts broken, and their baths cold. Most people, in the whole of Charlemagne's world, the overwhelming mass of them, lived their entire lives on the land, in small villages and scattered farmsteads, working the soil with wooden tools and the labour of oxen, and never travelling more than a few miles from the place where they had been born. The forest was everywhere, vast and dark and close, pressing in on every clearing, full of wolves and boar and bear. the source of timber and firewood and the pannage for the pigs, but also a place of real danger and old fear. Roads were few and bad. A journey of any distance was a serious and a perilous undertaking, measured in weeks, beset by mud and flood and broken bridges and the threat of robbers. And most people simply never made one. It was a world without clocks, where time was told by the sun and the seasons and the ringing of church bells, where the year turned on the festivals of the church and the rhythms of ploughing and harvest. It was a world lit, after dark, only by fire and by rushlight and by the costly flame of candles, so that the night was truly black in a way we can scarcely now imagine, the blackness crowding close around every small pool of firelight. It was a world where the winter was a real and a deadly enemy, where the cold killed, where a failed harvest meant not inconvenience, but hunger and death, where the stores laid by in autumn had to last until the spring, or people starved. Most people owned almost nothing: a few tools, a cooking pot, the clothes on their backs. Sickness came without warning and could not be cured, only endured or survived or died of, and it took the children most cruelly of all, so that to raise a child to adulthood was a thing of luck as much as care, and even kings and emperors buried child after child. And over all of it, woven through every hour of every life from the cradle to the grave, lay the deep and total presence of the Christian faith, or at least of the Church. For in the lands of the Franks Christianity was the air everyone breathed, the frame within which the whole of life was understood. The Church marked the hours and the days and the years. The Church baptized the newborn and married the living and buried the dead and prayed for their souls. Heaven and hell were not distant abstractions, but near and pressing realities, as real as the harvest and the weather. And the chief business of a life was, in the end, the salvation of the soul. This was the world, small, dark, dangerous, close to the earth, ruled by the seasons and the church and the ever-present nearness of death. A world that had largely forgotten the grandeur of the Rome whose ruins still towered over it. A world that could no longer read the books its ancestors had written, nor build the buildings its ancestors had built. Into this world Charlemagne was born, and upon this world he would set his own stamp, and out of this world, against all its smallness and its darkness, he would try by main force to build something larger and brighter and more ordered. Something that reached back toward the lost grandeur of Rome and forward toward a thing that had never quite existed before. To understand the man, you have always to remember the smallness of the world he started from and the size of the thing he was reaching for. The distance between the two is the measure of him. When Pepin the Short died, in the autumn of the year 768, the kingdom did not pass whole and undivided to his eldest son, as our instinct might tell us it should. It was split, in the old Frankish custom, between his two surviving sons. To Charlemagne the elder went one portion, to his younger brother, a young man named Karl, went another. And the two portions were drawn up in a way so strange and so tangled that it is hard looking at the map of it across all these centuries, not to suspect a deliberate cruelty in the arrangement, or at the least a deep mistrust. The lands of one brother wrapped awkwardly around the lands of the other. Their territories interlocked and overlapped at the edges like two hands, with the fingers knotted together, so that neither brother could move, could march an army anywhere, or defend any frontier, without crossing or skirting the lands of the other. Whether their father had designed it so on purpose to keep both sons weak and watchful and dependent, and thereby to prevent either from growing strong enough to threaten the new dynasty from within, or whether it had simply fallen out that way through the ordinary haggling of inheritance, the result was the same. The two young men did not love one another, They were rivals from the first hour of their joint reign, eyeing each other across that knotted frontier, each surrounded by his own counsellors and his own ambitions, and the kingdom of the Franks. So recently and so daringly seized by their father, now balanced uneasily on the brittle peace between two brothers who wished each other gone. The years of the two brothers were short, only 3 of them, but they were tense, and almost everything that survives from those years is a record of friction between the two courts. There was a rebellion early on, away in the south, in the great duchy of Aquitaine, and Charlemagne marched to put it down, and he sent word to his brother Carloman to bring his own forces and join him, as a brother and a fellow king should. Carloman came. He brought his army as far as the appointed meeting place, and then, having looked the situation over and weighed it in his own cold calculation, he turned his army around and went home, and left his elder brother to face the rising entirely alone. Charlemagne did face it alone. He pressed the campaign through to its hard end without his brother's help, and he won, and he subdued the south. But you may be very sure that he did not forget. You can see, in that one small, bitter episode, the whole shape of the thing between them. The younger brother, holding back, calculating his own advantage, unwilling to spend a single Frankish life to add to his elder brother's glory. The elder brother swallowing the insult, finishing the work himself with whatever he had, and filing the memory of the betrayal carefully away in that patient, unforgiving memory of his. It was not a partnership, it was a slow, cold, mutual watchfulness, waiting to see which way things would break. Their mother, a formidable and clever woman named Bertrada, who had outlived her husband and who carried real weight in the affairs of her sons, did what she could to hold the brittle piece together. It was she, more than anyone, who arranged the first of Charlemagne's marriages, and it was a marriage made wholly for a purpose. Away to the south, beyond the wall of the Alps, lay the kingdom of the Lombards, another Germanic people who had come down into Italy generations before, and who now ruled much of that peninsula and pressed constantly and dangerously on the lands of the Pope in Rome. Bertrada's idea, a mother's diplomacy, was to bind the Franks and the Lombards together by blood, and so to quiet the whole southern question, and to box in the troublesome Carloman between two allied powers besides. So she brought back over the mountains a Lombard princess, a daughter of the Lombard king Desiderius, to be the wife of her elder son. History has not even kept this poor woman's name with any certainty. She made the cold journey north over the passes. She was married to the young Frankish king, and she was his queen for something less than a single year. Because Charlemagne, for reasons that were partly the cooling of whatever there had been between them and partly the shifting arithmetic of his own ambitions, decided that he did not want her after all. He sent her back over the mountains to her father's court in Italy, returned like a thing found unsuitable, unwanted and unexplained and shamed, and the deep insult of it would help in time to set a war in motion. In her place, he took a young noblewoman of his own Frankish people, a girl named Hildegard, who was perhaps no more than 13 years old when they married, and who would become the companion of the central years of his life. She would bear him many children, 9 of them, one after another, in the space of barely a dozen years, carried through pregnancy after pregnancy across the endless roads of his moving kingdom, and she would wear herself out doing it, and die young. Not yet 30, long before the years of his greatest glory. But that grief lay far ahead, unseen. For now there was a new young queen, and there was still the brother, and the brother was still the problem. Through the year 771, the tension between the two of them tightened towards something that could only have ended soon. In open war between brothers, the very thing that could have torn the young dynasty apart and undone everything their father had built. The two courts watched each other across the knotted frontier. Nobles began quietly to take sides, to calculate which brother would win, and to place themselves accordingly. And then, in December of that year, the problem solved itself, suddenly and completely. Charlemagne fell ill. We are told it came on fast. Some hemorrhage or sickness of the body, and within a short time, the younger brother was dead. He was barely 20 years old. There is no good reason, in truth, to doubt that it was a natural death, for such things were terribly common in that age, and took the young as readily as the old. But it is impossible, all the same, not to notice how complete the deliverance was, and how perfectly timed, and how exactly it removed the one great obstacle in Charlemagne's path at the precise moment before the obstacle could become a war. And it is impossible not to notice the speed with which Charlemagne moved the instant his brother was in the ground. A speed that suggests a man who had thought long and carefully about exactly what he would do if ever this chance should come. He seized his dead brother's portion of the kingdom for himself, at once, before anyone could organize to stop him. He brushed aside his brother's widow and his brother's two small sons, little boys who had a real and rightful claim to their father's lands, and simply took everything. The widow, seeing how it would go, fled south with her children over the Alps, and threw herself and her sons upon the protection of the one ruler with cause to hate Charlemagne, the Lombard king Desiderius, the very man whose daughter Charlemagne had so recently sent home in disgrace. And Charlemagne, in a single stroke, in the chill of one December, became the sole king of all the Franks. He was perhaps 23 years old. Every single thing that came after, all of it, the conquests and the empire and the crown in Rome, the whole vast remainder of this story we are going to follow tonight, rested entirely on this one foundation. One brother, dead at exactly the right moment, one kingdom made whole again in a single pair of hands. It is worth pausing here, in the dark, to think about how all the world must have looked to him in that moment. This young man standing suddenly alone at the head of everything. The son of a king who had himself been the son of no king at all, now holding undivided power over the largest and strongest realm in all of Western Europe. To the south beyond the mountains, an angry Lombard king now sheltering his dead brother's family and nursing the old insult of the rejected bride, a war waiting to be born. In Rome, an anxious and exposed pope, looking northward as the popes always now did, for a strong protector. To the east, vast dark forests full of fierce pagan peoples, who had never in all their history bowed to any Frankish king. The young man holding all this could have chosen to sit still. He could have spent his reign consolidating what he had taken, enjoying it, defending it, growing old in comfort, as a strong king of a strong kingdom. He chose instead, almost from the first, to begin a program of war and conquest and expansion that would run for more than 4 decades, with scarcely a single year of true peace in all of it. Until he had very nearly doubled the size of the kingdom, he inherited and redrawn the entire map of a continent. The cold had not yet left the December air in which his brother died before the young king's eyes were already turning south, toward the mountains and toward Italy, and toward the first of all his wars. The road into Italy ran up and over the Alps, and in the year 773 the young king took it. The Pope, a man named Hadrian, had sent urgent word north. The Lombard king, that same Desiderius whose daughter had been sent home in shame, was pressing hard upon the lands of the church, seizing towns, threatening Rome itself, and demanding among other things that the Pope crown the 2 little sons of the dead Charlemagne as kings of the Franks, which, had it been done, would have split Charlemagne's hard-won kingdom clean in two and lit a civil war. It was exactly the kind of cry for help that the Frankish kings had bound themselves, by solemn oath and by their father's example, to answer. Pepin the Short had crossed into Italy to defend the Pope twice in his own day. Now the son would go, and he would go far further than his father had ever dreamed of going. It is hard for us, lying here warm beneath our blankets in the dark, to feel in our bones what it actually meant to move an army of thousands of men over those mountains in that age. The passes were narrow and high and treacherous, mere tracks clinging to the rock, choked with snow for the greater part of the year, where a baggage mule could lose its footing and be gone into a gorge in an instant, where men froze in the night and horses died of the cold and the thin air. And the Lombards, who knew the mountains were their great wall, had fortified the obvious passes and sat waiting behind their defences, confident that the Franks must come the one way an army could come and would be broken there in the narrow places. Charlemagne did not give them the battle they wanted. He divided his force. He sent one part of his army toward the fortified pass to hold the enemy's attention, and he led another part by a harder, higher, secret way through the peaks, around the flank of the Lombard defence. And somewhere up in the bare rock, the Lombards, looking down, realized that a Frankish army had appeared above and behind them, where no army was supposed to be able to come, and their whole prepared defence simply collapsed in panic and fell back. By the autumn, the Frankish host had come down out of the mountains onto the wide plain of northern Italy, the snow shaken from their cloaks, and Desiderius had abandoned the open country and shut himself up inside his great fortified capital, the ancient city of Pavia, and made ready for a siege. The siege of Pavia ground on through the whole of that winter and on into the following year. You must understand that sieges in that age were almost never matters of sudden storm and heroic assault upon the walls. They were matters of patience, of grinding, hungry, boring patience, of throwing a ring of armed men around a city and cutting it off from all food and all hope and all help from the outside, and then simply waiting, week after week, month after month, while hunger and sickness and despair did slowly, inside the walls, the work that swords could not do from outside them. And while his army sat in its cold camps around the walls of Pavia, waiting for the city to starve, Charlemagne did something that no Frankish king before him had ever done. He left the siege in the capable hands of his commanders, and he rode south with a chosen company of his great men all the way to Rome itself, to keep the feast of Easter in the old capital of the world. Picture the young king, who had grown up among timber halls and muddy hunting camps in the cold forests of the north, riding in through the gates of Rome in the spring of the year 774. The city was already unimaginably ancient, far older to him than the Roman ruins of his own day are to us. Its great buildings rose on every side, the baths and the forums and the triumphal arches and the towering broken aqueducts, half ruined now and overgrown with weeds, sheep grazing among fallen marble, but still standing in their thousands. Still vast beyond anything the young Frank had ever seen or imagined a man could build. He was met with the highest ceremony the church could offer. He climbed to the great basilica of St. Peter and prayed at the apostles' tomb, and there he met the Pope, Hadrian, and the two men took the careful measure of one another, the anxious bishop of an old and fragile and threatened see, and the young king of a young and growing and frightening power. And between them, in those Easter days, they deepened and sealed the bargain that would shape the whole of the coming age. The Franks would be the sword and shield of the church. The church would be the blessing and the legitimacy of the Franks. It was the first time Charlemagne saw Rome with his own eyes. It would not be the last, and the last time 26 years further on, would change the history of the world. He rode back north to his army and his siege, and in the early summer of that year, the city of Pavia, starved and sick and hopeless, at last opened its gates. Desiderius came out and surrendered himself and his crown. Charlemagne did not put him to death, which counted as a real mercy by the hard measure of those times. The defeated Lombard king was sent away into a monastery, his head shorn like the last Merovingians, and there he lived out the remainder of his days in prayer and silence, a king no more. And then Charlemagne did the thing that announced to all the world, more loudly than any proclamation could have, just how far his ambition now reached. He did not set up some pliable Lombard noble as a puppet king, a buffer and a client to hold Italy for him at arm's length, which is what a more cautious conqueror would have done. He took the crown of the Lombards himself and placed it on his own head, and from that day he styled himself King of the Franks and King of the Lombards, both two ancient peoples and two crowns gathered onto one head. He was now the master of much of Italy, as well as of all the broad lands beyond the Alps. The small boy who had grown up watching his father seize a single crown had, before he was 30 years old, made himself one of the most powerful men the West had seen since the last true emperor of Rome laid down his purple 3 centuries before. And he was, astonishingly, only at the very beginning. For while the war in Italy had been won cleanly in a single hard campaign, away to the northeast, across the river Rhine, there lay a war of an entirely different kind. A war that would not be settled in a season or a year or even a decade, but would grind on with brief false peaces and bloody fresh risings for the better part of his entire reign. It would prove to be the longest war he ever fought, and the bloodiest, and in some ways the very darkest thing he ever did. The Saxons were waiting for him in their forests, and the Saxon War would shadow the whole of his life. The Saxons were a people of the great dark woods and the wide marshes east of the Rhine, in the lands we would now think of as northern Germany. They were not one kingdom under one king, which made them all the harder to defeat. For there was no single throne to topple, no one crown to seize that would deliver the whole people. They were many separate peoples, loosely bound, fiercely and stubbornly independent, owing real allegiance to no overlord at all. And they were pagan. They worshipped their own old gods in their own sacred groves. They held a great pillar or tree trunk they called the Irminsul to be holy above all things. They lived in the old way their ancestors had lived for centuries beyond counting, and they had raided and skirmished back and forth across the Frankish frontier for as long as anyone on either side could remember. To Charlemagne, the Saxons presented two problems wound tightly and inseparably together, and it is genuinely hard, across the long distance of the centuries, to say with confidence which of the two weighed more heavily on him. They were a standing threat to the whole security of his eastern border, a people who would never be quiet and never be trusted while they remained free and armed and hostile on his doorstep. And they were heathens, living in the darkness outside the Christian faith, which to a king who increasingly understood himself as the appointed sword of the church was a kind of perpetual affront, an open wound in Christendom, a vast people perishing in their souls within reach of his armies. He resolved, very early and very firmly, that the Saxons must be brought to heel and brought to Christ, and that the two things would be accomplished as one together by force at the point of the Frankish spear, whatever it should cost and however long it should take. The war began in the year 772, before Italy was even finished, when Charlemagne marched into Saxony and destroyed the great Irminsul, the holy pillar, and carried off its treasure. And the war would not truly and finally end until past the year 804. More than 30 years. Lie still and think on the weight of that for a moment. A child born in the very year the war began could have grown to manhood, married, fathered children of his own, and seen the first grey come into his beard, and still the war in the forests would have been grinding on. The pattern of it was wearily, maddeningly familiar, and almost impossible to break. Charlemagne would march into Saxony at the head of a large army. The Saxons, who could not hope to meet so heavy a force in open battle, would scatter before it, and then their leaders would submit, would come in and give hostages and accept baptism and swear their solemn oaths of loyalty and faith. The Frankish army, satisfied, would withdraw and go home for the winter. And then, as soon as the king's back was turned and his spears were gone over the horizon, the Saxons would rise again, repudiate the baptism that had been forced upon them in the cold water, burn down the churches that had been built among them, kill or drive out the priests who had been left behind, and the whole bloody weary business would have to begin all over again from the start. It was a war against a people who would not stay conquered, fought by a king who would not, could not, stop trying to conquer them, and the cost of it, in blood and burning and grief on both sides, was terrible and long. We will come, before this night is over, to the very worst single thing that happened in all those 30 years, a deed whose dark memory has clung to Charlemagne's name down all the centuries since. But not yet. For now it is enough to know this, that even in the warm Italian summer, when the Lombard crown was set on his head and he stood at the dazzling height of his first triumph, the cold forests of the north were already quietly swallowing his armies, year after year, and would go on swallowing them for the rest of his fighting life. It is worth pausing, too, to understand what war itself actually meant in his world, the sheer machinery of it, because war was the constant of his entire life, the thing he did almost every single year. And it was nothing at all like the wars we know. There was no standing army in any modern sense. Each spring, as the roads dried and the grass grew enough to feed the horses, the king would summon his host, and the great men of the realm, the counts and the bishops and the lords, were bound by their oaths to come to him, each bringing his own armed followers, his own fighting men, equipped at their own cost. They gathered at an appointed place, this assembly of warriors with their horses and their spears and their shields, and from there they marched out, wherever the king pointed them, to fight through the campaigning season of the summer and the early autumn. And then, as the cold came on and the food ran short, to disband again and go home for the winter, to gather once more the following spring. The whole rhythm of his reign beat to this annual pulse of war, the muster in the spring, the campaign in the summer, the dispersal in the autumn, year after year for over 4 decades. It was a hard and a hungry business, this Frankish way of war. An army on the march was a vast, slow-moving consumer of food and forage, eating its way through the land it passed, and much of the real labour of any campaign was simply the feeding of it and the moving of it. The wagons and the supply trains, the endless problem of keeping thousands of men and horses fed in a world without roads or stores. Battles, when they came, were brutal and close and quickly over, decided by the shock of armoured horsemen and the press of men on foot, fought with sword and spear and axe. And a man who fell wounded in such a fight had little hope of skilled healing afterward. But pitched battles were in truth rather rare. Far more of the work of war was the grinding business of sieges, the slow starving out of fortified places, and the raiding and the burning and the laying waste of the enemy's land. The destruction of his crops and his villages to break his will and his power to resist. It was, by any measure, a savage school, and Charlemagne had been raised in it from boyhood and was a master of it. not so much through any genius on the battlefield, of which the records say surprisingly little, but through the harder and less glamorous arts of organization, of supply, of planning, of sheer relentless persistence, of knowing how to gather and move and feed a large army year after year, and how to keep coming back and back and back until the enemy at last broke, and the wars were almost without number. We have followed the great ones, the Lombards and the Saxons and the Avars, but there were many more besides, smaller wars on every frontier, woven through all the years. There was the long, hard pressure on the Muslim lands beyond the Pyrenees, where his armies pushed slowly south to carve out a defended march of frontier territory around Barcelona, a Christian bulwark against the south. There were the campaigns against the Slavic peoples on the eastern edges, beyond the conquered Saxons and the broken Avars, peoples who were brought, one after another, into at least a loose and tributary submission to the great emperor. There was trouble in Brittany in the far west, and trouble with the dukes of the south, and the constant low simmer of the frontiers, the raiding and the punishing and the holding of the line. And toward the very end of his life there came, out of the north, the first small dark warning of the storm that would break upon his successors. The Northmen, the Vikings, began to test the coasts and the river mouths of his empire with their swift raiding ships. And the old emperor, we are told, saw them once from a southern shore and wept, not for himself, for he knew they would not trouble him in his own lifetime, but for his children and his children's children, foreseeing with terrible clarity the harm that these sea raiders would one day do to the realm he had built. It is one of the last and most haunting images of him, the old conqueror standing on a shore, watching the small distant sails of a danger he would not live to face, and weeping for the world he would leave behind. The wars had made him, and the wars had made his empire. And now, at the very end, a new kind of war was gathering on the horizon that no muster of the Frankish host in the spring would be able to turn back. In the middle of all the Saxon years, there came a single campaign in the opposite direction, entirely far away to the southwest, down beyond the Pyrenees, into Spain. And though it was a small thing in the great scale of his wars, a brief and rather unsuccessful expedition that changed almost nothing, it left behind it the seed of a story that would outlive the empire itself, and grow, until it became one of the most beloved and most repeated tales in the long imagination of medieval Europe. It is worth our while to walk into it slowly tonight, because it shows us, more clearly than almost anything else, how history and legend can grow up together from the very same small seed and end up scarcely able to recognize one another at all. In the year 778, Charlemagne led an army south over the mountains into Spain. The greater part of that peninsula was then under Muslim rule, and the politics of it were tangled almost past following, with rival Muslim governors at bitter odds with one another. And Charlemagne had been invited into the quarrel by some of them against the others, with sweet promises that cities would throw open their gates to him, and rich rewards would fall into his hands. The campaign did not go at all as he had been promised. The city of Zaragoza, which he had been led to expect would welcome him, instead kept its gates barred and shut against him. He found himself deep inside a hot, dry, unfamiliar land, his promised allies wavering and melting away, his hoped-for prizes turning to nothing in his hands. And then, worst of all, word came riding hard from the north that the Saxons, the moment he had turned his back, had risen yet again in a great revolt. There was nothing left to do but give it all up, turn the whole army around, and march for home. And it was on the way home, as the long Frankish column wound its way back up into the high, narrow passes of the Pyrenees to climb over the mountains and down into Frankish land again. That disaster found them in the dusk. In a steep wooded pass, where the track narrowed and the army was strung out long and thin along it, with the fighting men in front and the heavy baggage train lumbering somewhere in the middle, and the rear guard bringing up the rear. The rear guard was ambushed. The attackers were not some royal army come to give battle. They were the local mountain people, the Basques, who knew every rock and every tree and every hidden goat path of those heights, as well as they knew their own hands, and who came down upon the strung-out, struggling, vulnerable tail of the Frankish column out of the trees above, in the failing light of evening, with the speed and the local knowledge of men fighting on their own ground. They fell on the rearguard and the baggage. They killed and they plundered in the narrow defile where the heavy Franks could not form up or manoeuvre or bring their numbers to bear. And then, before any ordered defence could be mounted against them, they were gone again, melted away back up into the forest and the rocks they had come from. The rearguard was cut to pieces. The baggage train, with much of the army's treasure and supply, was carried off. And a number of the leading men of Charlemagne's own court, men whose names were carefully written down afterward by those who kept the record of the king's deeds, were killed there, in that pass. Among the dead was an officer named Roland, the warden of one of the frontier districts, a man of whom, in the plain sober record of actual history, we know almost nothing else whatsoever. Not his face, not his deeds. Scarcely more than his name, and the fact that he died in that pass. The king could not even take his revenge, for the attackers had vanished into a wild country where no heavy Frankish army could hope to follow and catch them. He went home with a bitter, grinding knowledge of a rearguard, lost and good men, perhaps friends, dead behind him in the mountains. And in the plain, honest record of his long reign, the affair was nothing more than a minor reverse at the end of a minor and failed campaign. And yet, from that one small, dark, almost forgettable moment in a mountain pass at dusk, the imagination of the centuries that followed built something vast and golden and immortal. Over the next 300 years, in the mouths of poets and singers passing the tale from one to the next around countless fires, the obscure dead officer Roland slowly grew into a hero of impossible nobility and might. The greatest and most beloved of all the king's warriors, the very flower of Frankish chivalry. The handful of Basque raiders swelled into a vast pagan host of hundreds of thousands of Saracens. The squalid little ambush became a tragedy of betrayal. The noble Roland sold to the enemy by a traitor within the king's own ranks, holding the pass alone against the overwhelming horde. Too proud and too valiant to stoop to blow his great horn and summon help until it was far, far too late. Dying at the last beneath a tree, with his face turned defiantly toward the land of the enemy and his sword unbroken beside him. By the time it was all written down at last, in the great old poem we call the Song of Roland, the shabby and sorrowful little event had vanished almost entirely beneath the shining weight of the legend. And it was this legend, this glorious invention, and not the small sad history beneath it, that Europe took to its heart and remembered and sang and carried into its own battles for centuries afterward as the very model of how a hero ought to die. I find something quietly and deeply moving in that, lying here in the dark, thinking on it. A real man died in that pass on an ordinary evening, frightened most likely, in pain, certainly, far from his home, and was very nearly forgotten by everyone forever. And then the longing of later ages for a perfect hero reached back across the centuries, almost at random, and found his half-remembered name, and lifted it up, and made it deathless. The history is small and sad and true. The legend is enormous and golden, and also, in its own deeper way, true. And tonight we have stood quietly in the pass at dusk and seen them both at once. But we must turn now to the hardest part of the whole story, and I am going to handle it as gently and as honestly as I possibly can, because it cannot in conscience be left out, and it must not be dressed up or softened away either. We go back now to the long Saxon War, and to the year 782, and to a place on the river Allah called Verdun. The weary pattern of submission and revolt had been grinding on for 10 full years by then. The Saxons had risen once more, under a leader named Widukind, a Saxon nobleman who would not submit, who had become the very heart and soul and symbol of all Saxon resistance, slipping away each time beyond the reach of the Frankish armies to gather the rising yet again. A Frankish force, sent against the rebels, had been caught in the broken hilly country and badly beaten, with the loss of several of the king's important men. Charlemagne, who had been elsewhere when the disastrous news reached him, came north in a terrible fury. Widukind himself, the man he most wanted, had once again slipped through his fingers and away, this time into the lands of the Danes beyond the northern frontier, out of reach. But a great number of other Saxons, men who had taken part in the rising, or who were simply handed over by their own people in the desperate hope of buying back the king's peace, were brought before Charlemagne there at Verdun, on the bank of the river. And there, in a single day, upon Charlemagne's own direct order, they were put to death. The number set down plainly in the Frankish royal records is 4,500. It is a number so vast and so dreadful that some of those who have studied it most carefully across the years have wondered whether it can really be literally true, whether some error crept into the counting or the copying, whether the figure stands for something less precise and more terrible than an exact tally of the slain. But the records of his own court are quite plain about what was done. On one day, in one place, by the command of the king, thousands of captured Saxons were killed. It is the darkest single act of his long reign, and there is no softening it, and there should be no attempt to, whatever the cold strategic logic of it, whatever the genuine savagery of that long war on both its sides, whatever the harsh standards of an age that we should be slow and humble about judging by the comfortable lights of our own. The killing at Verdun was an atrocity, and it has hung like a shadow over Charlemagne's name for 1,200 years. And it should. I tell it to you plainly, in a single breath, without lingering over the horror of it, because that is the only honest way to tell such a realm, and because the man we are following through this night was truly capable of this, as well as of all the rest of it. He was not a saint, whatever a much later century would try to make of him. He was a man of his own hard time, a man who could build a shining chapel and gather the gentlest scholars of the age around his table and weep real tears at the deaths of his children, and who could also, on a grey day beside a northern river, give the order that ended the lives of thousands of bound and helpless prisoners. Both of those things are him. They are the same man. We do not have to choose between them, and we should not pretend either one of them away to make the other easier to hold. And here is perhaps the most terrible thing of all about it. The slaughter did not even work. It did not break the Saxon spirit, as it was surely meant to. The war ground on for more than 20 further years after that day at Verdun, rising and falling. And in the very end, it was not terror at all that brought the Saxons into the king's peace and the church's fold. It was patience and policy and the slow grinding weight of time and the gradual settling of Frankish power. That did at last what the horror by the river had so utterly failed to do. Let us step away now, for a good long while, from the wars and the dark deeds, and let us go and find the living man. We have been moving through battles and sieges and slaughters, and the man himself has been half hidden behind them, all this while, a distant figure on horseback at the head of an army, more a force than a person. But we know, as it happens, a great deal about what he was actually like, the living, breathing man inside the legend, in a way that we know almost no other figure from that far-off and ill-recorded age. For after the king was dead, a man who had known him closely and well, a small, clever, devoted scholar named Einhard, who had spent many years living at the court, sat down and wrote the story of his life, modelling it deliberately on the old Roman lives of the Caesars. And Einhard, because he loved his subject and had watched him with a friend's attentive eye, tells us 100 small human things that no chronicle of battles ever would. He tells us what the king looked like, how he carried himself, how he dressed and what he liked to eat, and how he spent the ordinary, unremarkable hours of an ordinary, unremarkable day. So let us spend such a day with him now, away from all the fighting, and let the man at last come properly into focus in the firelight. He was, Einhard tells us, a big man, tall and broadly, and powerfully built, with a thickness through the neck, and in his later years, a certain roundness settling about the belly, though it never made him anything less than commanding to look upon. He had large, bright, lively eyes, a longish nose, a head of fine hair that went a beautiful white in his old age, and a face that was open and cheerful and dignified all at once. The face of a man easy in his own authority. There was one surprising thing about him. For so large and imposing a man, his voice was unexpectedly high and thin and clear. Not the deep battlefield roar you might imagine coming from such a chest. He was restless, active, physical, a man who could not bear to be idle or shut up indoors for long. He loved to ride, and he loved above almost all things to hunt, crashing through the forests after the boar and the stag with his companions. And he kept this love to the very end of his life, an old man still in the saddle, and he loved, in particular, to swim. He was, Einhard says, so good a swimmer that no one could outdo him, and the place he came in the end to love best in all his vast lands, the place where he chose to build his great palace. He chose in large part because of the hot springs there, the warm waters bubbling up out of the earth. He would swim in those warm pools for the pure pleasure of it, and he liked company in the water and would call out to his sons and his nobles and his friends and his bodyguards to come in and join him, until sometimes there might be 100 men or more, all swimming together at once in the steaming water, with the most powerful man in all of Europe paddling and calling out among them like a boy. He dressed, by deliberate and stubborn choice, in the plain, ordinary clothing of his own Frankish people, and he disliked finery and grand foreign fashions intensely. His everyday dress was simple: a linen shirt and linen drawers next to the skin, then a tunic trimmed with a border of silk, the legs and feet wrapped about with bands and shod with plain shoes, and over the whole a cloak blue or grey, and always, at his side, that sword with the hilt and belt of gold. Only on the very greatest feast days of the year, or when some grand foreign embassy had to be properly impressed with the majesty of the Frankish king, would he consent, grudgingly, to put on the heavy cloth of gold and the jewels and the rich imported silks that other lesser rulers wore every day of their lives to puff themselves up. And even then you can feel, in Einhard's telling, that he did it as a duty and not a pleasure, and shed the finery again as soon as he decently could. Here was a man who could have draped himself head to foot in the plundered wealth of half the world, and who chose instead, by preference, to look very much like one of his own prosperous farmers in good honest wool. He was moderate in his eating and impatient with long, elaborate banquets, and though he could not at all abide fasting, and grumbled openly about it when the church required him to go without his food, he drank only sparingly and hated the sight of drunkenness in himself or in any man around him. At his dinner he liked, always, to have something read aloud to him while he ate, for he found bare eating a dull use of the time. He liked histories best of all, the tales of the deeds of the men of old, and he liked the writings of the old fathers of the church, and one book in particular was his great favourite, a difficult work by St. Augustine about the city of God, which suited very well a man who was beginning, more and more, to think of his own growing realm as a kind of city of God being built on the earth. After the midday meal in the long days of summer, he would take a little fruit and drink just once, and then he would strip off his clothes and his shoes exactly as though it were the night, and lie down and sleep for 2 or 3 hours through the heat of the afternoon. But his sleep at night was poor and broken. He would wake 4 or 5 times in the dark hours, and not merely wake and turn over, but rise right up out of his bed. And here, at last, we come back to the small quiet detail I told you about at the very beginning of this night, before the story had even properly started. For the king, this conqueror of kingdoms, this builder of palaces, this gatherer of the wisdom of the age, could not write. He had managed, late in life and only imperfectly, to learn to read after a fashion. But the actual physical forming of the letters, the holding of the pen or the stylus, and the careful making of the shapes of the words, this small skill that we hand to little children, almost without a second thought, had simply never been given to him in that rough warrior boyhood of moving camps and hunting and swordplay. And it troubled him deeply, all his life. He admired learning more than he admired almost anything else in the world. He gathered the cleverest and most learned men of the whole age around himself and delighted in their company. He could speak his own Frankish tongue and good Latin besides, and could understand Greek when he heard it spoken. And yet this one simple skill, the thing the humblest monastery schoolboy could do, he could not do. So Einhard tells us, very gently, he used to keep wax tablets and little blank books hidden away under the pillows and the coverings of his bed, so that in those long, broken, wakeful hours of the night, when sleep had abandoned him, he could lie there in the flickering dark and try over and over to train that huge hand to trace the shapes of the letters. He had begun too late, Einhard says, with a kindness that does not quite hide the sadness of it, and so he had little success at it in the end. There is no single image in all his crowded life that moves me more than this one. The master of the West, the man who would be crowned emperor in Rome, the terror of the Saxons and the Lombards and the Avars, lying awake alone in the small dead hours of the night, an old soldier with an enormous scarred and calloused hand, patiently, clumsily, hopelessly, trying to teach himself to write his own name in the dark. He never truly managed it, and in all those years, he never once stopped trying. It was this same hunger, this deep personal ache of respect for the learning that had been denied to him as a boy, that led him to do the work for which, in the very long reckoning of history, he may deserve the most lasting gratitude of all that he ever did. He gathered scholars. He understood, in a way that almost no warrior king before him had ever troubled to understand, that an empire could not truly be governed, nor the faith kept pure and right, nor a whole people lifted up out of ignorance, without men who could read and write and reckon and reason and teach, and that such men had grown terribly, dangerously scarce through the dark centuries of disorder since the fall of Rome. The old learning was guttering out like a candle at the end of its wick. Here and there, in a handful of scattered monasteries, a few small flames of it still burned, a few monks still copying out the old books, but the texts themselves had grown thick with errors. Copied and recopied by half-trained and weary hands until the meaning was half lost. The very Latin of the Church had decayed and grown corrupt. And through wide stretches of the kingdom, there was scarcely a soul to be found who could read a page aloud without stumbling badly over it. Charlemagne set himself, quite deliberately and with all the formidable weight of his will, to halt this long decline and to turn it back. And the revival he set in motion proved so far-reaching in its consequences that the historians of later ages have given it a grand name. They call it the Carolingian Renaissance, the rebirth of learning under Charles. And though it was a small and fragile and flickering thing measured against the great flowering of learning that would come to Europe many centuries later, it was the precise moment at which the fall was caught and reversed. And a very large measure of what we now possess of the whole ancient world we owe, quite directly, to it. He sent out across the world for the best minds he could find, wherever they happened to be. He brought learned men from Italy, from Spain, from far-off Ireland, which had kept its lamps of learning burning all through the dark times. And above all, most importantly of all, he brought from across the cold grey sea in England, from the cathedral school at York, which was then very likely the finest seat of learning in all the West, a churchman named Alcuin. And Alcuin became the master of the king's school, his own teacher, his trusted friend, and the guiding mind and the beating heart of the whole vast project of revival. Alcuin came to the moving Frankish court and slowly made of it a kind of academy, a school of the palace, gathered around the person of the king himself. And the most remarkable thing of all is that the king himself was a pupil in it. The most powerful man in Europe sat down humbly among the other students, asked his questions, made his mistakes, took for himself a scholar's playful nickname as all the members of the little academy did, calling himself David after the warrior king of the Old Testament. And out from that court, like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, the new and corrected learning spread slowly outward into the monasteries and the cathedral schools throughout the breadth of the empire, carried by a program of royal commands that reached, in the end, into nearly everything. Consider what that revival of learning actually meant, in plain and practical terms. Because it is so easy to let a grand phrase like the rebirth of learning float pleasantly past in the dark without ever feeling its true weight. It meant, first and most importantly of all, that the great texts of the ancient world, the poems and the histories and the speeches of the old Romans, the writings of the fathers of the church, and the very books of scripture themselves, were sought out wherever a copy could still be found, gathered in, painstakingly corrected against the best and oldest versions, and then copied out fresh and clean by trained and careful hands in the monastery writing rooms. And here is a thing genuinely worth marvelling at, lying here quietly in the dark. The great majority of the works of classical Latin literature that we still possess in the world today, the words of the Roman poets and historians and orators that schoolchildren and scholars still read, survive only and entirely because they were copied out afresh in the monasteries of Charlemagne's empire and in the generations that immediately followed it. For a powerful many of the ancient authors, the oldest surviving copy of their work that exists anywhere on the earth is a copy made by a Carolingian monk. Had that one great effort of copying and preserving not been made just then, at just that moment, when the old books were crumbling and the knowledge to read them was almost gone, much of the literature of Rome might simply have rotted away to dust and nothing in the damp of forgotten and unvisited libraries. Lost to us forever. We still read the words of Cicero and Virgil and the rest of them, in part because an unlettered Frankish warrior king who could not write his own name decided, out of his own deep longing, that the men who could write must be honoured and gathered and set to work saving what could still be saved. There was even a reform in the very shape of the letters themselves, and it is a small wonder that reaches right down the centuries and touches you, even now, even here. The handwriting of the age had grown cramped and crabbed and snarled and desperately hard to read, every region of the old Roman world having developed its own tangled local style, the words often run together without any space between them. All of it a labour to decipher. The scholars of Charlemagne's circle developed and spread abroad a new way of writing, a clear, round, open, beautiful hand, with proper spaces set cleanly between the words so the eye could find them, and a clear distinction made between the large capital letters and the small ones. So legible and so handsome was this new script that, many centuries later, when the very first printers of books were casting about for a clean and graceful model on which to base their printed type, they reached all the way back and took it for their own. The lowercase letters that you would be reading these very words in, were they printed on a page before you, are the direct and distant grandchildren of the script that was perfected 1200 years ago to please and to serve a king who could barely read it. There is a kind of deep, quiet justice in that, which I find I never tire of turning over. The one man who could never master his own letters left behind him, as one of his greatest gifts, a clearer and more beautiful way for all the world that came after, to make theirs. Let us go, for a few quiet minutes, into one of the places where the work of saving the books was actually done, for it is one of the most peaceful scenes in his story, and a good one to drift towards sleep upon. Picture a monastery somewhere in the empire on a winter's day, and within it the room they called the scriptorium, the writing room, where the monks did their copying. It is cold, for there can be no open flame near the precious books and the parchments, no fire to warm the hands that work there, only what little heat the day allows. The light comes from the windows, the pale, clean light of a northern winter, for the work can only be done by daylight and stops when the light fails. And along the desks sit the monks, bent over their slanted writing boards, each at his task, in a silence broken only by the small sounds of the work itself, the faint scratch of the quill pens on the parchment, the soft sound of a page being turned, the occasional whisper, think of what each of them is actually doing. Before him lies an older book, the copy he is working from, perhaps itself old and worn and hard to read, full of the errors of earlier copyists. And beside it lies the fresh new parchment, made from the prepared and scraped and smoothed skins of animals, costly and precious, that he is filling with the new clean copy. He dips his pen, cut from the flight feather of a goose, into the ink, and he forms the letters one by one, slowly, carefully, in that beautiful, clear, new round hand that the scholars of the emperor's court have spread to all the houses of the realm. The hand with the proper spaces between the words and the clear shapes that anyone can read. Page by page, line by line, letter by letter, he copies out the words of an ancient author, a Roman poet, dead 700 years, or one of the fathers of the church, or a book of the Holy Scripture, and as he does it, without perhaps fully understanding the vast importance of his small patient labour, he is reaching down across the centuries and saving those words from oblivion, passing them on, making one more copy that may survive when the old worn original has crumbled away to nothing. It is slow work and hard on the eyes and the back and the cramped hands, and a single book might take a man months to copy. The monks even wrote little complaints in the margins sometimes, small human notes about the cold, about their aching fingers, about how glad they were to be reaching the end. And yet upon that slow, patient work, repeated in monastery after monastery across Charlemagne's empire and the generations that followed it, the survival of the entire literature of the ancient world very largely depended. Every one of those carefully copied pages was a small act of rescue. The emperor himself never sat in such a room and never could have done the work, for he could not form the letters. But he understood its worth as few rulers ever have, and he commanded that it be done, and he honored the men who did it. And he gathered the scholars who corrected the texts and trained the copyists, and decided which books were worth the saving. And so the unlettered king became, through the hands of these patient monks, the great preserver of the very learning he himself could never fully share in. When you hold in your mind that quiet winter room, the bent backs, the scratching pens, the pale light, the breath misting in the cold air above the precious pages, you are looking at one of the truest monuments of his reign, more lasting by far than any of his conquests. A monument made not of marble or of gold, but of ink and parchment and patience, and of one man's strange deep reverence for the thing that had been denied to him. There is a larger point hidden in that cold room, and it is worth drawing out before we leave it. Charlemagne could not have known, could not possibly have foreseen, how much would one day hang upon the work he set in motion there. He thought, no doubt, in the practical terms of his own day, that he needed literate priests to serve the church properly, and corrected books so that the worship of God might be right, and schools so that there would be clerks to run his empire. These were his immediate purposes, and reasonable ones. But the true consequence ran far, far beyond anything he intended. By gathering the scholars and commanding the copying just at the moment when the old learning was on the very edge of vanishing forever, he caught it as it fell. A few decades later might have been too late. The knowledge to read the old scripts, the surviving old copies themselves, were so few and so fragile by his day that had the effort not been made just then, in his reign and at his command, the chain of transmission might simply have snapped, and the words of the ancient world might have been lost beyond any recovery. He did not save them for us. He had never heard of us and could not have imagined us. He saved them for his own reasons in his own time, but save them he did. And we are among the distant inheritors of that cold, patient work, and that perhaps is the truest and the most surprising kind of immortality a man can have. To reach down the centuries and touch the hands of people he could never have dreamed of, through the books he troubled to have saved. And all of this, the gathering of the scholars, the copying and correcting of the books, the teaching and the reforming and the founding of schools, all of it needed a place. A heart, a home. For the greater part of his long reign, Charlemagne had ruled exactly as his fathers had ruled before him, from no fixed seat at all. The whole court forever in motion across the land, here this month and 100 miles away the next. But as he grew older, as his joints stiffened, and the wars settled down from fresh conquest into the slow grind of holding the frontiers, as the business of learning and governing and judging thickened around him and demanded somewhere to be done, he came to want, at last, a home, a single place to call the centre of his world. And the place he chose, in the old heartland of his ancestors, in the low country near where the borders of modern Germany and Belgium and the Netherlands run together, was a place called Aachen. He chose it for several reasons, but partly and tellingly, he chose it for those hot springs that he loved. the warm mineral waters that bubbled up out of the ground there and had drawn people there since the days of the Romans, who had built their own baths there long before. And there, in the last 3 decades of his life, he built the thing that was meant to stand as the very heart and capital of his whole world, a new palace, a new Rome raised out of the cold mud and forest of the north. Picture Aachen as it rose, stone by hauled stone, over those years. At the centre of the whole complex stood the King's Hall, a vast building for the feasting and the councils and the daily business of the court, its walls hung with the spoils and the splendour of a continent. And at the far end of the complex, joined to the hall by a covered gallery and walkway, so that the king could pass between them, dry and warm, stood what has outlasted absolutely everything else. The one part of all his building that you can still walk into and stand inside today, 1200 years on. It was the chapel, and it was utterly unlike anything the Frankish world had ever built or seen before. For their models, Charlemagne and the masters he employed looked not at all to the low timber and thatch halls of the northern past, but reached back and southward to the Christian buildings of the old vanished empire, to Rome itself, and above all, to the city of Ravenna in Italy, where the dazzling churches of a lost age still stood in their shimmering glory of marble and gold and coloured glass. The chapel they raised at Aachen was built as a high-domed octagon, an 8-sided space, its interior soaring up and up through tiers of rounded arches to a dome far overhead, and every surface within it was made to gleam and glow and catch the light, and to build it and to adorn it as he wished. The king sent south for the things that the rough north simply could not make for itself. Columns of precious marble and dark gleaming porphyry were quarried out of the ancient ruined buildings of Rome and Ravenna, and then hauled at enormous and almost unimaginable cost and labour. The long way over the Alpine passes and down the rivers on barges to the building site in the cold forests of the north, so that the very stones of fallen imperial Rome were carried up bodily and set to stand again in a brand new church in the far country of the Franks. There were great doors and railings of cast bronze, made in workshops, set up at Aachen for the very purpose. There was gold and silver and the warm flicker of countless lamps and glittering mosaic worked across the curve of the dome and high up under the topmost arches, looking down on the whole shining space below. There was a plain stone throne, reached by a short flight of steps, upon which the king would sit to hear the worship rise up toward him from beneath. It must have been, to the ordinary people who came in out of the muddy, low, dark, smoke-filled timber world of the 8th century, very nearly overwhelming, an experience close to seeing heaven opened. Most of them had never in their lives seen marble, never seen a dome, never stood beneath a roof so high or in a space so flooded with coloured light. They came in out of a world of cramped dark rooms and smoking hearths and the endless grey of the northern weather, and they lifted their eyes up into this shining stone heaven that their king had somehow conjured up out of the bare ground, and it told them something that no words and no decree ever could have. It told them, without a single syllable, that the king of the Franks was the true heir of Rome, the appointed protector of the holy faith, a ruler of an entirely different and higher order from the petty squabbling warlords of the past. Charlemagne built, in marble and bronze and gold and light, a wordless argument about exactly what he was, and the argument was made so very well and so very solidly that it is standing in its place still. You can walk into that same chapel today, into the high octagon beneath the same dome, and look up and feel, across all the long centuries between, the exact thing that he so dearly wanted you to feel. We should linger too on the women who shared his long life, for there were several of them, and they passed through his story too quickly if we are not careful, and they deserve better than that. There was the unnamed Lombard princess of the very beginning, sent home in less than a year, of whom we know almost nothing but the insult of her dismissal. And then there was Hildegard, the young Frankish noblewoman he married in her place, perhaps only 13 when they wed, and she was the companion of the central and rising years of his life. The years of the Lombard War and the first Saxon campaigns and the building of his power. She bore him child after child, 9 of them in a dozen years, the sons who were meant to inherit the empire and the daughters he would never let go. And she did it all while travelling endlessly at his side, pregnant on the roads, pregnant in the camps, pregnant from one royal estate to the next, sharing the hard, restless, moving life of the court that never stood still. She must have been a woman of great strength and endurance to bear it all. And she wore herself out in the bearing. And she died young, not yet 30 years old, worn down by the children and the travelling and the years. He grieved her, and he remembered her, and many of the children who mattered most to the rest of his story were hers. After Hildegard came Fastrada, a woman of the eastern Frankish lands, and the records are less kind to her, hinting at a hardness, a cruelty even, suggesting that some of the harsher acts of those years and even some of the discontent that fed his son Pepin's rebellion were laid rightly or wrongly at her door. She too died before him. And then, late in his life, there was Luitgard, of whom the opposite is said, that she was a gentle and a virtuous and a calm woman, beloved at the court, kind to his children, a quiet, good presence in the later years. And she also died before him, leaving him, in his last decade and more, without a wife at all. And around and beyond these wives there were other women, connections the church would not bless as marriages, and more children by them, so that the great brood of his offspring, legitimate and otherwise, was very large indeed, and the court was full of his blood. There is much that this long succession of wives and this great crowd of children tells us. It tells us, first, the plain hard truth of how short and how dangerous life was, even at the very summit of that world. That an emperor who could command all of the West could not command that his wives should live, and buried one after another, and buried child after child, besides, the young alongside the old. It tells us something of the man's own nature too, this clear need of his, for the warmth of a wife and a family about him. The same need that kept his daughters at his side, and filled his hall with his children and his grandchildren. A deep domestic warmth in a man capable also of terrible coldness and terrible violence. And it tells us, in the hard light of policy, how very much the vast structure of his empire rested, in the end, on the frail thread of his own family, on which sons lived and which died, on who might inherit and who might rebel, on the accidents of birth and death within a single household. For all his armies and his laws and his envoys, the future of everything he had built came down, in the end, to his children, and to the cruel lottery of which of them would outlive him. He had 9 children by Hildegard alone, and many more besides, sons raised to be kings. And yet, as we have seen, by the very end, nearly all of them were dead before him, and the great inheritance hung by a single surviving thread. The warmth of that crowded hall, full of his wives across the years, and his many children and his grandchildren, was real, and it was one of the truest pleasures of his life. But it was also, though he could not have known it, the most fragile possession he had, more fragile by far than any frontier or any law, And in the end, it was the breaking of that family thread, far more than any enemy or any army, that would undo the work of his life within a generation of his death. But before we follow him out of the palace and onward to the crown, we should stay a while longer within these shining walls and look at the man, not as the king or the builder, but as something more ordinary and more tangled, as the father, the husband, the warm and difficult centre of a great and complicated household. For Charlemagne's family was a whole crowded world unto itself, full of real love and real warmth, and shot through also with a strange, possessive, controlling streak that puzzled even the people of his own day, and you cannot truly know the man until you have spent an evening among his children. He loved his children, by every single account that comes down to us, with a deep and open and demonstrative tenderness, and he wanted them around him, near him, always. He had a good many of them. Across his several marriages and his connections outside of marriage, sons and daughters both, and the palace at Aachen at its fullest must have rung and echoed with the noise of them, the children, and then in time, the grandchildren too. The king treated his sons and his daughters very differently though, and in that difference you can read something deep about how his mind worked. The strange mixture of warm love and cold calculation that ran like twin threads through everything he ever did. His sons he raised from the first to rule. The plan for most of his life was the old plain Frankish plan. The same custom that had so nearly set him against his own brother, that the realm would one day be divided up among his sons. And so he set them up early in life, gave each of them a kingdom of his own to learn the hard trade of ruling in under his eye. One son, the second, was made king down in Italy, sent south while still a boy to govern the old conquered Lombard lands and to learn how to hold them. Another, the youngest of his sons by his great queen Hildegard, a boy named Louis, was made king of Aquitaine, away in the southwest of the realm on the dangerous border with Muslim Spain, while he was still very small. Dressed in the manner and the costume of the people there, and sent off to hold that southern frontier in his father's name and grow up into the holding of it. And the eldest of Hildegard's sons, called Charles after his father, the king kept closer to home and to himself, marking him out to inherit the Frankish heartland itself, the very core of everything. He drilled them all in war and in the business of government, and he meant, for many years, for the great empire to go on after him, divided but secure in the strong hands of these three sons. But there was an older son than any of these three, from before all of it, from the king's very first connection, as a young man, a boy, born of a woman whom the church, with its hardening rules about what made a marriage, would later refuse to count as a proper and lawful wife. This eldest son of all had a curved and twisted spine, and history, with its usual hard tongue, has fixed upon him forever the cruel name of Pepin the Hunchback. And as the younger sons of the grander, more lawful marriages rose in the world and were given their kingdoms, this firstborn son watched his own place, the place he might once have expected as the eldest, slowly slipping away from him. He saw a younger half-brother given a kingdom in Italy, and even, in a baptism in Rome, given the very name Pepin that had been his own, as though to wipe him out and replace him. He watched the whole inheritance being arranged and parcelled out around him, as though he simply were not there at all, as though he had already ceased to count. And in the year 792, he did what slighted and disinherited sons have done all through history. He joined himself secretly to a faction of discontented Frankish nobles, men with grievances of their own against the king, and together they conspired to overthrow Charlemagne and seize the throne. But the plot was discovered, betrayed from within, before it could be put into motion. The nobles who had joined it were seized and put to death. But his son the king did not kill. He had his eldest boy, the firstborn of all his children, shut away inside a monastery, his head shaved into the tonsure of a monk, his name and his ambitions and his very future set aside and locked behind walls, there to live out the long remainder of his life in enforced prayer and silence. And there, years later, he died, a king's eldest son who had reached up for what he could not have and lost in the reaching even the little that had been left to him. It is one of the saddest threads in the tangled family story, the crippled firstborn who rebelled and was put quietly and permanently away, and the father who could give that order and then turn and go on, loving, warmly and openly. The other children who remained to him. The daughters were a different matter altogether, and stranger by far, and here Charlemagne did something that openly puzzled even the people of his own time, and has gone on puzzling everyone who has studied him ever since. He would not let them marry. He had a number of daughters, several of them grown to full womanhood, and he kept every last one of them at home, at court, around him, year after year after year, deep into their adult lives, and he would not give a single one of them away in marriage. Not to a great Frankish nobleman, which would have raised up some family too high and given it a claim. Not to a foreign prince across the sea or over the mountains, which would have bound him into alliances with strings he did not want to be pulled by. Not to anyone at all. Einhard, who saw the strange business with his own eyes there at the court, set down his plain bewilderment at it in words that still carry his shrug down the centuries, saying that, strange to say, although the king plainly loved his daughters very dearly, he could never once bring himself to give any one of them to any man in marriage, and that he said he simply could not do without their company and their society about him. There was cold, hard policy buried in it somewhere, almost certainly. A married daughter meant a son-in-law with a claim on the family, a foreign alliance with its own demands, a grandchild who might one day rise up to complicate and contest the careful succession he was building for his sons. By keeping all his daughters unmarried, he shut every one of those dangers firmly out, but the policy had a strange and very human consequence inside the warm, crowded walls of the palace. The daughters, forbidden husbands of their own, did not, on that account, live like quiet nuns. They formed attachments and love affairs at the lively court, took lovers from among the king's own great companions and courtiers, and bore children by them. And the king, the same king who would not let them marry, looked the other way. He kept them close. He welcomed their children, his irregular grandchildren, into the family with open affection, and he would not hear a single ill word spoken against his girls, refusing, it was said, even to believe the gossip about them. It is one of the very oddest corners of all his life, this warm, crowded, slightly scandalous court, full of grown unmarried princesses and their quiet, half-acknowledged families, all of it presided over by a doting and powerful father who loved his daughters too much, or trusted the wide world with them too little, ever to let a single one of them go. And there is a hard little coda to it. After the old king was finally dead, the one son who succeeded him, the pious and far more rigid and correct Louis, lost almost no time at all in clearing his sisters out of the palace and packing them off, one and all, to live in convents, to tidy away the scandal his father had so happily tolerated. But while the old king yet lived, he kept them, every one of them, gathered close around him in the warmth and the firelight. and he would not let them leave his side. While the long Saxon war ground on without end in the north, and the family thickened and tangled around him at court, Charlemagne went on, widening his world in every other direction at once, almost without rest. His was a reign of astonishingly little peace, and the frontiers of the Frankish realm pushed steadily outward, year upon year, until at last they enclosed the greater part of Western and Central Europe under one single hand, for the first time since the far-off days of Rome. Two of these great widenings of the realm are worth our while to dwell on tonight, because each of them brought something new and remarkable into the story. The one, a whole rich kingdom swallowed whole, and the other, a treasure so vast it beggared the imagination of the men who found it. To the southeast of the Frankish heartland lay Bavaria, a great and wealthy and ancient duchy on the upper reaches of the Danube, which had been ruled for generations by a proud line of dukes, who were themselves distant kin to Charlemagne, and who had grown thoroughly used to a near-total independence under the looser order of the past. The duke in Charlemagne's own day was a man named Tassilo, his own cousin, who had ruled in Bavaria since he was a boy, and who governed his rich land very nearly as a king in his own right, founding his own monasteries, fighting his own wars against the Slavs on his eastern border, keeping his own counsel, and bending the knee to his Frankish cousin only as little and as grudgingly as he possibly could. To a ruler like Charlemagne, who was by now steadily and deliberately gathering all the power of his world into the centre, into his own hands, a great half-independent duchy ruled by an over-mighty and resentful cousin was simply a thing that could not be allowed to go on standing. In the year 788, he moved against Tassilo, and tellingly, he moved against him, not chiefly with armies and open battle, but with law and accusation and the slow machinery of justice. He charged the duke with old betrayals and broken oaths, reaching all the way back to his father Pepin's day, with having deserted a royal campaign long ago, with treating with the enemies of the Franks. Tassilo was summoned before a great assembly of the realm, tried, condemned, and given the now thoroughly familiar fate of the defeated in Charlemagne's world. His head was shorn, and he was shut away into a monastery to pray out his remaining days, and his whole proud ancient duchy was simply swallowed, absorbed, governed, from then on, directly by the king's own appointed officers. A whole kingdom in all but name folded quietly into the realm, its duke praying away his life behind monastery walls, and now Charlemagne's writ ran all the way east to the edge of a wild and dangerous frontier, where the next thing was already waiting for him. For beyond Bavaria, out on the great flat grassland plains along the middle Danube, in the lands we would now call Hungary, there lived a people called the Avars. They were horsemen out of the far east, kin in their way to the Huns of an earlier and more terrible age, and for more than 2 full centuries they had been the scourge and the terror of Central Europe. Sweeping out of their plains to raid far and wide, exacting tribute by threat and by force from peoples and empires all around them, including, over the years, vast payments in gold, extorted from the wealthy Christian empire at Constantinople. And all that plunder, all that gold and silver and tribute, gathered in over 200 years of raiding and extortion, they had heaped up and hoarded within the fortified heart of their land. A huge ring-shaped stronghold of earthworks and palisades that the Franks came to call, simply, the Ring. In the years after Bavaria fell into his hand, Charlemagne turned his armies at last against the Avars, and over several hard campaigns, led in great part by his son, the young king of Italy, and by the bold lords of the eastern frontier marches. The long-feared Avar power was broken, and broken utterly, and the ring itself was stormed and taken. And what the Franks found heaped up inside it became a legend in its own day, repeated in wonder throughout the West. 2 full centuries of accumulated treasure, gold and silver, and jewels and silk and coin without end, the gathered plunder of generations of raiding, all of it piled up within the Avar stronghold, and now, in a stroke, suddenly, Charlemagne's Dache, they say the wagons of it, hauling the treasure back westward to Aachen, rolled along the roads for days on end. The chroniclers, groping for some way to make their readers feel the sheer scale of it, simply wrote that before the Avar War, the Franks had seemed almost a poor people, and that after it, they were rich beyond anything they had ever before known or dreamed. And Charlemagne did with this fabulous windfall exactly what a wise and pious and shrewd king of his age was expected to do with such a realm. He kept a portion, he rewarded his loyal followers and his fighting men with a lavish open hand, binding them to him with gold, and a very large share of it he gave away to churches and monasteries the length and breadth of his realm, endowing the houses of God with the plunder of the heathen. He even sent a generous portion of it as a princely gift across the sea to a fellow Christian king far away in England, so that the hoarded gold of the Eastern horsemen ended up, of all things, adorning the altars of churches in places the Avars had never so much as heard the names of. As for the Avars themselves, who had terrorized Central Europe for 2 long centuries, they passed almost entirely out of history within a single generation of the fall of their ring, their power shattered, their treasure scattered through the churches of the West, their very name fading away into a memory and then into nothing at all. And the Frankish realm now reached, almost unbelievably, from the grey Atlantic in the west to the lands of the Slavs in the east, from the cold conquered forests of Saxony in the north, down across the high Alps and deep into sunlit Italy in the south. There was no power remotely like it anywhere in the west. There had been no power like it for 300 years and more. Not since the eagles of Rome were furled. And the unspoken question that now hung over all of it, growing larger and heavier with every conquest, was simply this: what ought such a realm to be called? And what, in the name of God, ought a man who ruled all of it to be? That question was about to be answered, suddenly and forever, on one particular cold morning. In Rome, the long road to that morning began, of all places, with a violent crime in a Roman street. In the spring of the year 799, the Pope, a man named Leo, who had not long held the office, was riding in solemn procession through the city of Rome when he was set upon, suddenly and brutally, by a band of armed men, kinsmen and supporters of the previous Pope, who hated Leo and meant that day to destroy him utterly. They dragged him down from his horse in the street, and their purpose was a deliberate and a terrible one. They meant to blind him, to put out his eyes, and to cut out his tongue, for the calculated reason that a man so horribly maimed, a man without his sight and without his speech, could never again serve as Pope, could never say the Mass, or read the Scripture, or lead the people, and so would be finished, disqualified forever from the holy office they wished to take from him. They set about this dreadful work upon him there in the street, and they did him grievous harm, and they left him for ruined and fled. But Leo was rescued by his own people, before the worst could be fully accomplished, and he was carried away and hidden, and he recovered, more fully than his enemies had ever intended that he should. And finding that he could not possibly be safe within his own city, surrounded by such enemies, he did the one thing that the popes of that age had learned, again and again, to do when the ground gave way beneath their feet. He fled north, he went over the Alps, the battered and frightened Bishop of Rome, all the long hard way to the one man left in all the world who was strong enough to set him back upon his throne. He went to Charlemagne. The king was then far away in the north, in the Saxon country, at a place called Paderborn, and there, into his camp, the battered fugitive pope came at last, and the two men met face to face. Picture that meeting for a moment, here in the dark, because the whole meaning of the entire age is somehow gathered up and held within it. On the one side, the Bishop of Rome, the heir of St. Peter, the single highest spiritual authority in all the Western world, the keeper of the keys of heaven, arrived as a hunted and homeless fugitive, with the half-healed marks of violence still plain upon his face and his throat. His enemies behind him in Rome, busily spreading vile accusations to justify what they had tried to do to him. And on the other side, the king of the Franks and the Lombards, a towering figure now at the absolute height of his power and his glory, the master of more of Europe than any single man had held in 300 years. The conqueror of the Lombards and the Saxons and the Avars, the only protector and the only hope that the broken pope had left anywhere in all the world. The pope needed the king, desperately, to restore him to his city and his throne, and to clear his stained name of the foul charges his enemies were flinging at it. And the king, though perhaps he did not yet say the thing aloud, even to himself, was on the very edge of discovering what the Pope, and only the Pope, could give to him in return for that protection. What exactly passed between the two of them there at Paderborn? What was said and what was hinted, and what was darkly understood without being said at all? No one ever wrote down for us, and we would give a great deal to know. But when the Pope at last rode south again toward Rome, he rode with a strong Frankish escort to guard him, and with the king's own solemn promise to follow him to Rome before long. And the unspoken question of the empty throne of the West hung, heavy and unresolved, in the air between them. For there was, in a sense, an empty throne. Far away to the east, in the great and glittering and ancient city of Constantinople, there still sat a Roman emperor, the true and unbroken successor of Augustus and Constantine and all the long line of the Caesars, ruling over the surviving eastern half of the old Roman world that men of a much later age would learn to call the Byzantine Empire. In the strict letter of the law and in their own unshakable view of themselves, those emperors in Constantinople were still the emperors of the Romans, the only real ones there had ever been or could be, and the West, for all its kings, had simply had no emperor of its own for 300 years since the last shadow emperor was set aside. But at this precise moment in history, the imperial throne in Constantinople was held by a woman, the Empress Irene, who had seized the supreme power into her own hands by the monstrous expedient of having her own son, the rightful young emperor, seized and blinded and deposed. And to a powerful many men in the West, the very idea of a woman holding the sacred imperial title was no true holding of it at all, was an absurdity, an emptiness. The throne of the Roman emperor. Some of them in the West had quietly begun to murmur to one another, was in plain truth standing empty. And here in the West, was a man who already ruled an empire in everything but the name of one, who already protected the church as an emperor should, who had now restored the very Pope to his throne, and who looked, to anyone who beheld him, more like a true Roman emperor than any man had looked in living memory or for many lifetimes before it. All the pieces were laid out upon the board now. They needed only a hand to move them. Charlemagne came down to Rome, as he had promised, in the late autumn of the year 800. He came, on the face of it, to settle the Pope's troubled business once and for all, to sit and to hear the grave accusations, and to judge between Leo and his accusers, and to restore good order to the dangerously disturbed city. And it was itself a matter of the most enormous weight and significance, almost an upending of the proper order of the world, that the king of the Franks should come and sit in judgment in Rome over the very fate of the Pope, for a mere earthly king, however mighty, had no business presuming to judge the heir of St. Peter, the vicar of Christ on the earth. In the end, the dangerous business was managed with the most exquisite delicacy by all concerned. The king would not, in the end, presume actually to judge the Pope, for that road led to questions no one wished to open. Instead, it was arranged that the Pope, freely and of his own holy will, would swear a solemn public oath before God and the assembled people that he was wholly innocent of every one of the charges his enemies had brought against him, and so clear himself by his own sacred word. And his accusers were then condemned and sent away into exile. That solemn oath was sworn on the 23rd day of December. 2 days after that came Christmas, and on the morning of Christmas Day, in the year 800, all the greatest men of Rome and all the greatest men of the Franks gathered together in the old Basilica of St. Peter, not the vast and famous church that stands upon that spot today, which was built many centuries afterward, but the ancient and venerable one that had stood there before it since the first great age of Christian Rome, to celebrate together the high mass of the Lord's Nativity. And there, amid the candlelight and the rising incense and the chanting of the choir, the deed was done at last that would echo down the next 1,000 years. Picture the inside of that old basilica on the winter morning of the great feast. It was already an ancient building, raised long before in the first flush of Christian Rome. Its long central hall lined on either side with great columns taken from still older Roman ruins, no two of them quite matching, the worn marble floor hollowed and polished by the feet of 4 centuries of pilgrims. The air within it that morning was thick and blue and sweet, with the smoke of incense, and hundreds upon hundreds of candles and lamps burned in the dim winter light, and at the far end, above the holy place where the bones of the Apostle Peter himself were said to rest, there was the deep glow of gold, and there, in that sacred space, the Frankish king knelt down at prayer before the tomb of the Apostle, a huge man even on his knees, dressed even here, on this of all mornings, not in cloth of gold, but, by his own account at least, in the plainer manner he favoured, bowed down in the most sacred spot in all the Western world on the holiest morning of the whole Christian year. And as he rose from his prayer, the Pope, Leo, came forward toward him, and in his 2 hands the Pope held a crown, and he lifted it, and he set it down upon the king's bowed head. And in that same instant, the people gathered and waiting in the great basilica, primed and ready for the moment, lifted up their voices all together and acclaimed him aloud in the old formula of the Romans, crying out that to Charles, the most pious Augustus, crowned by God, the peace-bringing emperor of the Romans, be life and victory. 3 times the great acclamation rang out and echoed beneath the ancient roof, filling the whole vast smoky space with sound, and the Pope bowed low before him, and in that moment, in that incense-filled hall, on that cold Christmas morning, the Roman Empire was, in the eyes of all the West, reborn and made flesh again in the person of a Frankish king. For the first time in well over 300 years, since the very last flicker of the old Western line had guttered out into darkness, there was once again an emperor in the West, a true Augustus, crowned in Rome at the tomb of St. Peter by the hand of the Pope himself. Now here is the strange part, the genuine puzzle at the very heart of it. The thing that men have argued over and turned around and around ever since that morning. His own biographer, the little scholar Einhard, who knew him so closely and so well, tells us plainly that Charlemagne said afterward that he would never have entered the church at all that day, holy feast though it was, if he had only known beforehand what the Pope was intending to do. He claimed, in other words, to have been taken completely by surprise, crowned before he could say a word to prevent it, his consent neither sought nor given. And the historians have picked that single astonishing claim up and turned it over and over in their hands for 1200 years, and they have never once agreed on what on earth to make of it. On the one hand, it seems scarcely believable, almost impossible, that a ceremony of such colossal weight and meaning, with a crown made ready to hand, and a crowd primed and waiting with the exact ancient words of the acclamation on their lips, could possibly have been sprung as a complete surprise upon the single most powerful and most closely attended man in all of Europe. Surely the thing must have been discussed, arranged, negotiated, prepared in careful secret beforehand, and yet, on the other hand, there were very good reasons indeed why a wise and far-seeing man might wish afterward to seem to have been surprised by it. To have openly sought and grasped at the crown would have made him look grasping and ambitious in an unseemly way. And far worse than that, far more dangerous, it would have made the imperial crown look like the Pope's own possession, a thing that was the Pope's to give. And that raised, immediately, a terrible and a lasting question, one that would trouble emperors and popes alike for centuries to come. If the Pope had the power to give the imperial crown, then the Pope might also, surely, have the power to take it away again. The Pope, in crowning the emperor, might in some sense stand above the very emperor he had crowned. That was a question that Charlemagne and all his heirs after him would have given almost anything never to have had raised at all, and a convincing show of reluctant, holy surprise was perhaps one clever way to muffle it. To suggest that the king had not sought this thing, that it had come upon him unbidden as a kind of divine surprise, rather than as a gift bestowed by a calculating pope. We will never truly know what was in his mind and his heart that morning as the cold gold came down onto his head, whether it was genuine astonishment or a careful and statesmanlike performance of astonishment, or some restless mixture of the two warring in him at once. But whatever he truly felt in that instant, the deed itself was done, irrevocably done, and it could never afterward be undone. And the West had an emperor once again. And consider what it meant, this enormous new title that he now carried away from Rome upon his head. In one plain sense, nothing whatsoever had changed on that Christmas morning. He ruled exactly the same lands at noon that he had ruled at dawn. Not one new province had been added to his realm, not one new soldier raised to his banners, by the mere placing of a circle of gold upon his head. And yet, in another and a deeper sense, everything had changed, utterly and forever. For the idea of it was simply enormous. He was no longer merely the king of one people among the many peoples of the earth, the king of the Franks, with the Lombards thrown in for good measure. He was now the emperor, the Augustus, the heir, in title and in dignity, at the very least, of Augustus and of Constantine, the secular head of all of Western Christendom gathered into one person, a figure of a wholly different and higher and more sacred order than any mere king. Think on the arc of it, here in the dark, the grandson of a man who had been no king at all, only a mayor of the palace, a servant of servants. The son of an usurper who had reached up and seized a crown that was not his by blood. The boy raised in muddy moving timber halls who never could be taught to write his own name. That same man now wore the single most exalted and most ancient title that the whole Western world still possessed. From the obscure and humble mayors of the palace to the imperial crown of Rome itself, in just 3 generations of one family. It is one of the most extraordinary and breathtaking ascents in the entire long history of Europe. And it reached its dizzying summit there, in the smell of incense and the glow of 1,000 candles on a December morning, in an old basilica full of golden light, with a great crowd crying out the old words 3 times beneath the ancient roof. Think, too, of how strange the new title must have sat upon him at first, and upon all those around him, in the ordinary days after that extraordinary morning. He did not become a different man for having a crown on his head. He was still the same big, restless figure in plain Frankish wool. Still the man who loved to swim and to hunt, and to have histories read aloud at dinner. Still the old soldier who could not write his own name. And yet now, when the documents were drawn up, and the oaths were sworn, and the envoys came, there was this vast new word attached to him, this title out of the deep Roman past, Augustus, Emperor. A word that had not been spoken of a Western ruler in the memory of anyone alive or their grandparents before them. It had to be worked out, in practice, what it even meant. New seals had to be cut. New forms of words found for his letters and his laws. A new dignity learned and worn. The men around him had to learn to think of their king as something more than a king. And he himself, in the years that followed, took the thing with great seriousness, brooding on what it laid on him. This new and awful responsibility for the whole Christian people, not merely the Franks now, but in some sense, all of Christendom. The crown did not change the daily man, but it changed, slowly and profoundly, the scale of what he understood himself to be for, and the weight of the answer he believed he would one day have to give to God for the souls in his keeping. A title given in an instant, in the smoke and gold of one morning, took years to settle fully onto the shoulders of the man, and he spent the remainder of his life growing into the enormous thing that had been placed upon him. Not everyone in the wide world, of course, was willing to call him emperor, and the trouble came, as it was always bound to come, from the east. In Constantinople, when the news arrived that a Frankish king had been crowned emperor of the Romans in the old Western capital, it was received as something between an absurdity and an outright outrage. To the Greeks of the Eastern Empire, there was one Roman emperor, and one only, and he, or in this strange moment she, sat in Constantinople, as the emperors had sat for centuries, in unbroken and sacred succession from the Caesars themselves. This Charles, this barbarian king up from the dark forests of the north, this man who could not even read, an emperor of the Romans, the very idea was beyond bearing. The very notion was an usurpation, a presumption, a grasping insult, a thing simply not to be acknowledged by any right-thinking person. And so for years the two courts circled one another warily over the question, the Franks insisting stubbornly upon the title, the Greeks refusing with equal stubbornness to grant it. There was even, for a strange while, a remarkable notion floated about between the courts, that the whole awkward and dangerous business might be neatly resolved if the widowed Charlemagne were simply to marry the Empress Irene, that same woman who had blinded her own son to seize the throne, and so unite the two long-sundered halves of the old Roman world, the East and the West, in a single imperial marriage bed. Nothing ever came of the strange idea. Irene was herself overthrown and deposed in Constantinople before it could be pursued any further. But the very fact that such an idea could be seriously discussed at all shows how genuinely unsettled the whole question was. How strange and new and contested and frankly improbable this reborn Western Empire felt to the people who were actually living through its birth. In the end, the Greeks gave a little ground, but only a little, and only grudgingly, and only after years had passed. After patient negotiation, and after Charlemagne had handed back to them some territory along the Adriatic coast that the Eastern Empire wanted. The court at Constantinople agreed at last, with poor grace, to acknowledge him with the bare title of emperor. But not, mark this well, Emperor of the Romans. That precious phrase, those particular words, they would never, ever concede. For those words belonged to their own man in Constantinople and to no other soul on the earth. But emperor, plainly and simply, without the Roman, that much they would allow him. It was a careful, face-saving formula. The kind of diplomatic compromise that lets both proud parties keep the one thing that matters most to each of them. Charlemagne had his imperial dignity acknowledged at last by the very heirs of Rome themselves, which was no small thing, and the Greeks kept safe their own exclusive and unbroken claim to be the one true Rome. And so there were now, where for so long there had been but two emperors in all of Christendom, a Western one and an Eastern one, eyeing each other with wary suspicion over the breadth of the European world, and the old unity of the Roman world, already long shattered, in hard fact, was now broken in name and in title too, broken in a way that would never afterward be mended, not in 1,000 years. The crown that the Pope had set upon Charlemagne's head in old St. Peter's had quietly remade the entire map of the world's imagination. And the work of that one Christmas morning would go on echoing down the centuries, in ways that not a single soul in that incense-filled basilica could possibly have begun to foresee. But a title, however grand and ancient and hard-won, did it not by itself govern an empire? And here we come to what was in truth the very deepest and hardest problem of his long reign, a problem far harder than any battle he ever fought. Roads needed mending, and justice needed doing, and oaths of loyalty needed swearing and keeping, and good coins needed minting, and the king's commands needed somehow to be carried out. All of this across a realm so impossibly vast that a man on a good horse might ride for many weeks on end and still never reach its farthest edge. And all of it had to be done in an age that had no proper roads worth the name, since the Romans let theirs crumble. No swift system of messengers, no settled body of trained officials, no real bureaucracy of any kind, and scarcely a single soul, anywhere outside the church, who could so much as read a written order, let alone draft one. How one single man, however mighty, however tireless, was to hold such an enormous and unwieldy thing together, and make his will run from one end of it to the other, was the great riddle of his rule. It is in sober truth the central question of his whole achievement as a ruler, far harder and far less glorious than the winning of any war. And the answers that he found to it were as much a part of his greatness as any conquest ever was. He could not, being only one man, be everywhere at once. And so he hit upon the device of sending out others to be his eyes and his voice and his reach. He created a body of royal envoys, sending them out across the whole empire, and he sent them out always in pairs, and usually with one churchman and one layman bound together in each pair, so that each of the two might watch and check and report upon the other, and neither be too easily corrupted. And these paired envoys carried the emperor's own full authority with them into every distant corner of the realm. They travelled their assigned districts on their circuits. They heard the complaints of the ordinary people. They checked closely upon the counts and the bishops who governed each region in the king's name. making sure these powerful local men were not abusing their power or lining their own pockets or ignoring the emperor's will. They saw to it that the king's commands were truly being obeyed and his justice truly being done. And then they carried word back to the centre, to Aachen, of how things actually stood out in the provinces, of where there was trouble and where there was peace. They were the living thread that stitched the far-flung provinces back to the throne. The means by which the will of one man sitting at Aachen could be made to reach down into a village a full month's hard ride away. It was an ingenious and a genuinely original answer to a very nearly impossible problem, and it worked. More or less, well enough. For as long as there was a strong and feared emperor sitting at the centre to give it all its force and its meaning. And he made law, a very large measure of law, issued out in a steady stream of what we call his capitularies. The chapters and the articles in which he set down his royal will upon every subject under the sun. They are an astonishing window straight into his restless mind and his sprawling reign, these documents, for they show us a ruler who concerned himself, personally and seriously, with absolutely everything. There are articles in them on how the army was to be raised and mustered and supplied, and on how the courts of justice were to be held and conducted. But there are also articles, set down with the very same care, on how the great estates of the crown were to be managed right down to the proper keeping of the hens, and the geese, and the planting, and the tending of the gardens and orchards. There are articles fixing the right weights and measures for the whole realm, and the proper standard and value of the coinage. There are articles on how the priests were to be educated so they could understand their own holy office, and on how the monks were to live according to their rule, and articles commanding that schools be set up at the monasteries and cathedrals, that the poor be properly cared for, that false oaths be sternly punished, even articles on how the right sacred songs were to be sung in the right way in the churches. He reformed the very coinage of his world, fixing a new and trustworthy standard of silver pennies that would go on to underlie the money of much of Europe for many centuries afterward, so that even the pounds and the pennies of a much later age can trace their distant descent back to his careful reform. He tried by the sheer overwhelming force of his own will, and by law, and by the patient unglamorous labour of his travelling envoys, to impose order and honesty and learning and Christian righteousness upon a vast and unruly and half-wild world, to make of his great sprawling empire something that was actually governed and actually Christian and actually good. He did not in the end fully succeed in it, for no man living in that age could possibly have fully succeeded at so impossible a task. But the attempt itself, the sheer breathtaking reach of the ambition behind it, and the deep seriousness with which this unlettered old warrior king set himself to the patient, dull, unglorious, essential work of trying to govern well, is one of the very things that lifts him up and sets him apart, high above the ordinary common run of conquerors, the men who knew well enough how to take and to smash and to seize, but who never once troubled themselves to learn the far harder art of how to keep and to build and to rule. There is one story from these years of the settled empire that I love above almost all the others, because it shows, better than any law or any battle, just how wide the world of the emperor had become, and how far the fame of him now ran. For Charlemagne, master of the Christian West, reached out in friendship over half the known world to a man who was in his own way his only equal. The great caliph who ruled the vast and dazzling Islamic empire of the East from the fabulous city of Baghdad, a ruler named Harun al-Rashid, whose own name has come down to us, wrapped in the legends of the 1001 Nights. The two of them, the Frankish emperor in his cold northern Aachen, and the Abbasid Caliph, in his sun-baked golden Baghdad, were almost exact contemporaries, the two mightiest rulers of their age at the opposite ends of the world from one another. And they had, as it happened, interests in common, shared enemies, and shared concerns, and so they sent embassies back and forth across the length of the world to one another. Gifts and letters and goodwill carried on journeys that took years to complete in each direction, and out of that strange long-distance friendship between the two great rulers came the most wonderful thing. Charlemagne had sent an embassy east to Baghdad, and among the men he sent was an interpreter, a Jewish merchant named Isaac, who knew the Arabic tongue. And when, after long years, the return embassy at last came back toward the west, it brought with it the caliph's gifts to the Frankish emperor, and the gifts were marvels. There were rich silks and perfumes and precious things. There was, in a later embassy, an astonishing brass water clock, a device of such ingenuity that the Franks could scarcely believe it, that marked a passing of the hours by dropping little metal balls one by one onto a sounding cymbal, and from which, at each of the 12 hours, 12 tiny mechanical horsemen came riding out of 12 little opening windows. To people who told the time by the sun and the candle, a machine that could measure and announce the hours of its own accord with moving figures must have seemed very nearly like sorcery, a glimpse of a wisdom and a craft far beyond anything the West could make. But the greatest wonder of all, the gift that became a legend in its own right and a household name throughout the whole of Francia and Germany, was an elephant. The Caliph sent Charlemagne an elephant, a great grey beast named Abul Abbas, brought all the long impossible way from the heart of the East. Think of the journey of that one animal. It came by ship over the Mediterranean and was landed on the coast of Italy, and then it was walked on its own enormous feet, the long way north, up through Italy and over the high passes of the Alps that had swallowed so many of the emperor's soldiers, and down at last into the cold green north, to Aachen. No one in Francia had ever seen such a creature, or anything remotely like it. There were no elephants in the bestiaries that anyone had actually beheld, only rumours and old tales. And now here was one, real and living and vast, swaying down the road into the imperial city, its great ears flapping, its strange long nose swinging. A living marvel out of the farthest east, come to live at the court of the Frankish emperor. The people came out to stare and to wonder. Abul Abbas lived for some years at Charlemagne's court, a treasured possession, the pride of the menagerie, a walking sign to all the world of how far the emperor's friendships now reached, all the way to fabled Baghdad and back. And when at last the beast died, some years later, having been taken north on one of the emperor's campaigns, it was mourned, and its death was carefully noted down in the royal records, alongside the deaths of bishops and the outcomes of battles, as though the passing of the emperor's elephant were itself an event in the history of the reign. And so it was. There is something in that one image, the elephant from Baghdad swaying through the northern forests toward Aachen, that tells you more about the scale and the strangeness and the sheer reach of Charlemagne's world than 100 pages of law and conquest ever could. And consider what it was like, that world he had gathered around himself, on an ordinary evening, when there was no battle and no embassy and no great council, only the daily round of the court at rest. Let us spend one such evening there, in the firelight, before we go on to the harder things. The hall at Aachen in the evening was a place of warmth and noise and light, a refuge carved out against the cold dark of the northern winter, pressing in at the shuttered windows. The long tables were set up, and the household gathered, the powerful and the humble, the scholars and the clerks, the soldiers of the guard, the women of the family, the endless stream of visitors and envoys and petitioners who were always passing through. The fires roared in the hearths, and the smoke rose up into the high dark roof. Food came in from the kitchens, the roasted meat the emperor loved, brought hot from the spits. For he was a hearty eater of roast game above all things, and grumbled when his doctors tried in his old age to make him give it up and eat boiled meat instead. The wine and the ale went round, and as they ate, the reader read aloud from his book, the histories or the writings of St. Augustine, his single voice carrying over the quieter sounds of the hall, and the emperor listened, and now and then put a question, or made a remark, and the scholars answered him. After the eating there was talk, and there was music. The harp passed from hand to hand. The old songs of the deeds of the Frankish kings of long ago sung out into the warm air, the songs that Charlemagne loved so well that, we are told, he had them gathered and written down, so they would not be lost, though sadly that collection has not come down to us. There were the daughters, the unmarried princesses, moving among the company, and the grandchildren underfoot. There were the scholars of the little academy, falling perhaps into one of their famous debates, trading riddles and verses and arguments in their elegant Latin, with the emperor himself joining in. For he loved this kind of sport of the mind above almost any other entertainment, and presiding over the whole warm, crowded scene, the great man himself, in his plain Frankish wool, his high, clear voice cutting through the noise, restless even at his ease. A giant at the heart of the world he had made. It was not a grand or a formal court by the measure of later ages, not a place of stiff ceremony and cold magnificence. It was something warmer and rougher and more human than that, more like the hall of a very great chieftain than the palace of an emperor, full of family and learning and argument and song and the smell of roasting meat and wood smoke. And it was, for those who were lucky enough to be admitted to it, very nearly the centre of the world. To sit at that table, in that firelight, hearing that high voice ask its questions, was to sit at the very heart of the West, in the one place where, for a few short decades, all the threads of a continent were gathered into a single pair of restless hands. Imagine now that you are coming to Aachen for the first time, as so many thousands did across those years, a traveller from some far corner of the empire, perhaps a man with a grievance to lay before the emperor's justice, or an envoy from a distant people, or simply one of the crowd of the realm's business drawn always toward its centre. You have been many days on the road. You have come through the forests and along the bad tracks and across the rivers. And at last, as you draw near, the signs of the place begin to gather around you. The traffic on the road thickens, the carts and the riders and the walkers all flowing the same way. And then you see it rising ahead, the palace complex on its rising ground, the great hall, and joined to it, the high, strange shape of the chapel with its dome, a building unlike anything in your own country, unlike anything you have ever seen, and you understand at once, before a word is spoken, that you have come to the heart of the world. The place is a swarm of life and noise. There are soldiers of the guard, and grooms with horses, and servants hurrying on errands, and merchants who have come to sell to the court, and clerks with their parchments, and churchmen, and beggars hoping for the famous charity, and other petitioners like yourself, waiting, hoping for their hour. There are languages you do not know being spoken all around you, for the emperor's court draws men from every land. There may be, if you are very fortunate in the year of your visit, the grey shape of the elephant somewhere about, the marvel from the east, and you will hardly believe your own eyes. The air smells of horses and wood smoke and cooking, and the press of many people. And over all of it hangs the knowledge that somewhere within, in the great hall, is the man himself, the Emperor Charles, whose name is spoken with awe in every land from the ocean to the Slavs, and that you, a small person from a small place, may perhaps, if your business is judged worthy, actually stand before him. And if that hour comes, if you are brought at last into the hall and into his presence, what you find is not, perhaps, what you expected. You may have imagined some remote and glittering figure swathed in gold and jewels upon a high throne. Instead, you find a very large old man in plain Frankish wool, much like the clothing of any prosperous man of your own land. Only the sword at his side and the bearing of him, marking him out, a big man with white hair and bright eyes, and when he speaks, a voice oddly high and clear for so great a frame. He is direct. He asks questions. He listens, or does not. The famous justice of the emperor is rough and personal and immediate, the judgment of a strong man rather than the grinding of a vast machine of law. And whatever he decides, you will carry the memory of it home with you for the rest of your life. The day you stood before Charles the Great in his hall at Aachen, the day you saw with your own eyes the centre of the world, the man who held it together, and you will tell your children of it, and they will tell theirs, until it passes into the long memory of your family and your village. The day one of us went to Aachen and stood before the emperor. That, in the end, is perhaps the thing hardest for us to feel over the centuries. Lying here in our own age of screens, and instant words flung around the whole earth in a heartbeat. In his world, he was almost the only point of unity that existed, the one thread that bound a continent together, and that thread ran, quite literally, through his own person, through the man himself in his hall. There was no abstract state, no impersonal government, no machinery that ran on without him. There was the emperor, and the men who served him, and the personal bonds of oath and loyalty that tied the vast structure to his single will. It held together because he held it together by the sheer force and presence and persistence of the man. And that is also, of course, exactly why it could not long outlast him. Why it began to come apart almost the moment that great presence was gone from the hall. A thing held together by one man's hands falls when those hands are stilled. But while he lived, while he sat in that hall and asked his blunt questions and gave his rough justice and gathered the threads of the world into his grip, there was an unity in the West such as there had not been for 300 years and would not be again for many more. And to come into his presence was to come into the very centre of that, the still point around which a whole age turned. To understand the man truly, all the way down, you have to understand that beneath the conqueror and beneath the lawgiver there lay always, and at the very bottom of him, a deeply and a seriously religious man. And that very nearly everything else he did flowed in some measure out of that deep spring. He believed, with a rock-hard conviction that was the very bedrock of his whole reign, that God himself had set him up over the Christian people as their ruler and their shepherd, and that he would one day have to stand and answer to God, on the last and dreadful day of judgment, for every single soul that had been placed in his keeping. This was not, for him, some pious decoration laid lightly over the surface of his power. A thing for show, it was the very meaning and the purpose of the power itself. A king, an emperor, was to him a man charged directly by heaven with the care of his people's bodies and their immortal souls together, both at once, and a ruler who let his people fall into ignorance, or into error, or into sin, was a ruler who had failed utterly in the one task that mattered more than all the others put together. And so it was that the very same man who reformed the coinage and mustered the armies and pushed out the frontiers threw himself with an exactly equal seriousness into the reform of the church and the correction and purification of the faith. Because to him, in his own mind, these were never separate enterprises at all. They were all one single work, the work of building the city of God upon the earth. He cared, to a degree that can genuinely startle us now, about getting the smallest details of the worship of God exactly right. He sent away to Rome itself for correct and authoritative copies of the prayers and the chants, so that the worship offered up to God all across the length and breadth of his vast empire might be made uniform and proper and correct and pleasing in heaven, rather than the wild tangle of local variation and half-remembered error that it had decayed into over the dark centuries. He worried constantly about whether his clergy were learned enough to do their sacred work at all, about whether the ordinary parish priests could even understand the Latin words of the Mass that they spoke aloud every day, about whether the monks in their houses were truly living as their holy rule required them to live. And he issued command after command after command to set all of these things in order, to found the schools, to correct the books, to see that the men who served at God's altar were at the very least fit and learned enough to serve there. He gathered the churchmen of his realm together in great councils to thrash out the difficult questions of doctrine and belief, and he involved himself in them personally, deeply. This unlettered king, sitting among his bishops and his scholars, and pressing them hard on the finest and subtlest points of the faith. He saw himself, in an image that captures all of it perfectly, as a kind of king out of the Old Testament. A new David, a new Josiah, a ruler anointed by God to lead his chosen people and to cleanse and purify their worship and to govern them in righteousness and in the fear of the Lord. It was an enormous, a colossal conception of what a ruler was actually for, far larger than mere power or conquest, and he held to it with the whole weight of his heavy, earnest, striving soul. Whatever we make of the violence of his many wars, and we have not flinched tonight from looking squarely at the very worst of it, we have to set down beside it this other thing, which is every bit as real and every bit as much a part of the true man, the genuine, consuming, lifelong desire of him to do right by his God and by the people he so firmly believed his God had entrusted into his hands. And then, as the new century turned, and his life's work seemed at last very nearly complete, the empire forged and held, the imperial crown won and acknowledged, the faith ordered and the learning revived. The evening of his own life began to close in around him, and it closed in as evenings do with sorrow, for a king who had built so very much, and built it all for his sons to inherit. The very cruelest blow of all his last years was this, that his sons began to die before him. He had planned the whole future out so very carefully, with all his lawgivers' love of good order. The great empire was to be divided peacefully and according to plan among his 3 living, legitimate sons, each of them already a tried and seasoned king in his own region, each of them prepared across long, patient years to take up his appointed share of the whole. The eldest, Charles, who bore his own father's name, was to have the rich Frankish heartland, the very core of everything. The second son was to keep the southern kingdom of Italy, which he already ruled. And the youngest, Louis, the boy who had been made king of Aquitaine when he was scarcely more than an infant, was to have his own portion in the south and the west. The succession was settled, written down, sworn to. The future of the dynasty and the empire seemed secure, provided for, safe. And then, in the space of barely more than a year, it all came apart in his hands. In the year 810, the second son, the king of Italy, sickened and died. And then, in the very next year, in 811, the eldest son too, Charles, the namesake, the heir to the very heart of the whole empire, died as well suddenly, with no son of his own living to follow after him. 2 grown sons, 2 kings, gone into the cold ground in 2 years. And the old emperor, who was now standing at the very edge of 70, and who had already outlived so very much in his long life, his parents and his brother, and several of his wives. The young Hildegard, who had borne him so many of his children, and worn herself out doing it, now had to stand and watch 2 more of his grown sons, men he had raised and trained and loved and meant to rule the world, go down into their graves ahead of him. We are told that he wept. Of course he wept. What father would not have? The whole careful, beautiful structure of the succession that he had spent years building lay in ruins and ashes around him, and the raw grief of it was simply the grief of any father anywhere who must bury his own children. A grief made no lighter at all, not 1 ounce lighter, by the heavy crown upon his head. Of the 3 strong sons he had so carefully groomed to carry his empire forward into the future, only one was left to him now. The youngest, Louis, the quiet, pious, bookish king of distant Aquitaine, who had never once been the son his father expected to inherit everything, who had been raised only to hold one frontier, and who now, by the simple cruel subtraction of death, was suddenly all that remained. The whole vast empire, every last mile and soul of it, would now come down, undivided, to this one unlikely surviving son. And so, in the failing of his strength, and amid the wreckage of all his careful plans, the old emperor gathered himself to perform the very last act of his long reign, and he resolved, pointedly and deliberately, to perform it entirely in his own way, and to make of it one final statement to the world. There is a quiet sorrow in the texture of those last years that is worth sitting with for a moment, here in the dark, before we come to the very end. For the old emperor's world, in his final decade, was slowly emptying around him, the way the world empties around all who live to an age. The companions of his prime were dying. Alcuin, the beloved master of his school, the friend and teacher of so many years, had died some years before, full of honour, in the Abbey of Tours, that the emperor had given into his keeping. And the loss of that wise, gentle presence and that long friendship was a real grief. Others of the scholars and the men who had filled his hall in the bright rising years were gone too, one by one, into their graves, and the faces around the emperor in his old age were younger faces, men who had not been there at the beginning, who knew the old deeds only as stories, who had not ridden the early campaigns, or sat in the first sessions of the school. It is a particular loneliness, the loneliness of the one who outlives his own generation, who finds himself at the last among strangers in the very hall he built, the only one left who remembers how it all began. Even the elephant died. Abul Abbas, the grey marvel from Baghdad, the wonder that had swayed its way over the Alps to amaze the north, had lived some years at the court, a treasured and famous creature. And then, when the old emperor took his army north once more, in his late years, to deal with trouble on the Danish frontier, he took the elephant with him, this strange aging companion, and somewhere on that northern campaign the beast sickened and died, far from the hot eastern lands of its birth. In the cold of the north, it was never made for. And its death was written down in the royal records, gravely among the affairs of state, as though the realm itself had lost something in losing it. There is something almost unbearably poignant in that small fact. The emperor in his old age and his strange elephant going north together to the wars, and the elephant dying there in the cold, and the old man noting its passing. The marvels of the bright years were fading. The friends were dying. The sons, as we have seen, were dying, the worst grief of all. The world that he had gathered and built and filled was thinning out around him, growing quiet, growing old as he grew old, and he sat at the centre of it, the last of his generation, the white-haired emperor in his cooling hall, with the shadows lengthening. He had ruled for over 40 years by now. He had outlived almost everyone. He had seen his empire reach its height, and his family begin to fail. He had stood on the southern shore and watched the small sails of the Northmen and wept for the future. He was tired now in his bones, in a way that all his restless energy could no longer quite drive off, and his great body, which had carried him through so much, was beginning at last to betray him, the strength ebbing, the old swimmer and rider and hunter slowing down. And it is in this mood, this autumn of a long and crowded life, with the friends gone and the sons buried and the world grown quiet around him, that he gathered himself for the last great deliberate act of his reign, the crowning of the one son left to him, and made ready, though he did not yet know how near it was, for the end of everything. In the year 813, broken now by grief and by old age, and by the slow failing of that body that had carried him so far, the old emperor summoned his one last surviving son to come north to him at Aachen. And he called together all the chief men of the whole realm into a great and solemn assembly, gathered in the shining chapel that he himself had built. And there he did something that he had plainly thought about long and hard. A thing that said, without a single word of explanation needed, exactly what he had come to believe about the true nature and the true source of his own imperial power. Cast your mind back 13 years to Rome, to that Christmas morning there. The crown had come down onto his own bowed head from out of the hands of the Pope, and all the world had been left ever after to wonder uneasily what that had truly meant. Whether it meant that the Pope therefore stood somehow above the Emperor, whether the imperial power was in the end the Church's own to give and to withhold. Now, in crowning his own son and heir, Charlemagne would leave no such dangerous doubt hanging in the air. There was no Pope present at Aachen that day. There was no churchman of any kind brought forward to place the crown. The Emperor had the imperial crown itself carried into the chapel, and then, with his own 2 hands, his own enormous, aged, trembling hands, he took it up, and he lifted it, and he set it down himself on the head of his son Louis, and named him co-emperor and the heir of all his dignity, by his own sole authority, and by no one else's on the earth. The meaning of the gesture was utterly unmistakable to every soul who stood and watched it happen. The crown was the emperor's own to give. It passed from father to son within the family, by the strength and the blood right of the house that had won it by its own hand, and it owed nothing whatsoever to any other power on the earth, not even to Rome, not even to the Pope. It was the very last great political act of all his life, and it was a quiet thunderclap of a statement, made not in any words at all, but in the simple, heavy, deliberate gesture of an old man's hands lifting a circle of gold and setting it down on his last living boy's head, there in the glow of the candles, in the very heart of the shining chapel he had raised up to be the heart of the whole Christian West. His son went away again, back south to his own kingdom of Aquitaine, the crown of co-emperor now on his unlikely head, and the old emperor spent that last autumn of his life as he had spent so very many of the autumns before it, doing the one thing he had loved best of all in all the world since he was a small boy. He went out hunting in the forests. An old man, well past 70 now, still somehow up in the saddle, still riding out under the turning leaves to chase the game through the trees, as he had done as a boy in his father's restless moving court more than 70 long years before, as he had done all his life in every land he ever conquered. And then, on the first day of November, he came home to Aachen in from the forests for the last time. And there, as the winter closed its grey fist slowly over the low northern country, the long road of his life came at last to its quiet end. In the January of the year 814, he was struck down with a high fever, and he did exactly what he had always done all his life whenever a fever took hold of him. He took to his bed, and he refused all food, trusting, as he had always trusted, that the fasting would in time drive the sickness out of him, as it had driven out so many fevers before across the years. But this time the old remedy did not heal him. This time the fasting did not work. The fever was soon joined by a sharp and stabbing pain in his side, a pleurisy, an inflammation deep in the chest that turned every single breath into a hard and a painful labour. And the old body that had carried him through 47 years of reigning and a lifetime of war, and the hunt and the endless road simply could not. This time, throw the sickness off. He had taken to his bed on the 21st day of January. He lingered there, growing weaker, for 7 days. At the very last he took the Holy Communion, the body of the Lord, as a Christian should at his ending. And then, on the 28th day of January, in the year 814, at 9 o'clock in the morning, in his own palace at Aachen, in the 72nd year of his life and the 47th year of his long reign, Charlemagne died. Lie still and picture those 7 last days, for they are the close of everything we have followed tonight. The great hall that had rung with his high clear voice and the songs of the Frankish kings and the arguments of the scholars was hushed now. In the chamber, the old emperor lay in his bed, the fever burning in him, the breath coming hard and shallow with the pain in his side, and around him moved the household in the low voices that gather around a dying great man. The servants, the physicians who could do nothing, the few of the family near at hand. He had always, all his life, refused his food when the fever came, sure that the fasting would mend him, and he refused it now, taking only the occasional sip to keep a little strength in him. And the doctors who urged him to eat could not move him, for he had always been a man who trusted his own judgment of his own body over theirs. The winter pressed grey and cold at the shuttered windows. The short days came and went, the light failing early. And the man who had ridden over the Alps and stood crowned in Rome and held a continent in his grip lay quiet now, growing weaker by the day, his strength ebbing out of him at the last, like the tide going out. And when he knew that the end had come, he did what mattered most to him, the deeply religious man beneath all the rest. He received the Holy Communion, the body of his Lord, making his peace with the God he had believed. All his life had set him over the Christian people and would judge him for them at the last. And then, his account with heaven settled as well as he could settle it, on the morning of the 28th of January, with the cold winter light coming pale through the windows. He died. They did not have to carry him far at all. The chapel that he had built, the high shining octagon, with its marble columns hauled all the way over the Alps and its dome of glittering gold. The new Rome that he had raised up with such care and such cost out of the cold northern forest, stood only a few steps away from the chamber where he lay dead. And there, on the very same day that he died, while the grief of his court and his household gathered around the news, and while that news began its slow journey outward across the vast empire, along the roads and the rivers he had governed, riding out to tell the world that the emperor was gone, they laid the body of Charlemagne to rest beneath the stone floor of his own church. The man who had remade the entire map of Europe, who had been crowned by the Pope in Rome, and who had crowned his own son with his own hands at Aachen, who had gathered up and saved the learning of the whole ancient world, and yet could never to the end of his days write his own name, was set down at last in the candle-lit, gold-glowing heart of the world that he himself had made, and the restless, striving life, the life that had scarcely once paused for breath in 7 full decades of conquering and building and ruling and reaching, was finally, at last, still. And so we come to what became of the great thing that he had built. The honest answer is that it did not long outlive him in the shape that he had given it. And there is a hard and a humbling lesson buried in that, about how even the very mightiest work of one man's hands depends, in the end, on the hands of others to carry it onward after he is gone. His son Louis, the pious and earnest survivor of all that grief, inherited the whole undivided empire, every mile of it, and he was not a bad man, nor even truly a bad ruler, but he was not his father. And the plain truth is that few men who have ever lived could possibly have been. Under Louis, the old troubles and tensions that Charlemagne's sheer overwhelming force of personality had held down and held back for so long began slowly to stir again and to rise. And when Louis, in his own turn, died, his own sons fell at once to bitter quarrelling over the inheritance, brother turning against brother, until at last the vast empire that Charlemagne had spent an entire lifetime forging and hammering into one single whole was carved up coldly among them by treaty into separate kingdoms, a western part and an eastern part, and a disputed strip of contested land lying in between the two. And out of those very divisions, dimly at first, across the centuries that would follow, you can already begin to make out the distant emerging outlines of the France and the Germany that were one day to come. The empire of one strong hand became the squabble of many weaker ones. And as if the world itself meant to mock the order he had spent his life imposing upon it, even as his own grandsons were busy cutting his lands to pieces among themselves, new and terrible raiders were already coming down out of the cold north, the Vikings in their swift long ships, falling upon the coasts and sweeping up the very rivers of his empire, burning and plundering, sacking even the quiet monasteries where his beloved scholars had laboured so patiently to save the learning of the world. The great peace that he had made did not hold. The hard-won unity that he had forged did not last. Within just 2 generations of that cold January morning at Aachen, the empire as he had known it and built it was simply gone, broken up and scattered. And yet to say only that, and to stop there, is to miss the very deepest truth of the man almost entirely. For the thing that he truly built, what mattered and what lasted, was never really that empire of provinces and frontiers that his grandsons so quickly cut to pieces. The thing he truly built was an idea. And the idea proved in the end very nearly immortal, far more durable than any border drawn on any map. He had shown the world that there could be, once again, here in the West, such a realm as a Christian emperor, a single anointed sovereign crowned in Rome itself to stand at the very head of all of Christendom, the heir of the Caesars and the sword of the Church together in one person. And the dream of that, the shining memory of that, did not die at all when his actual empire crumbled and fragmented. It lived on and on and on. For a full 1,000 years afterward, rulers in the very heart of Europe would lay claim to his crown and call themselves the heirs of his empire. The Holy Roman Empire. That strange and enduring thing which lasted in one shape or another, all the way down until barely 2 centuries ago, took its very origin and its founding idea directly from the work of that one Christmas morning. The kings of France traced the root of their majesty back to him. The emperors of Germany traced the source of their title back to him. He became, in the collective memory of the continent, a kind of common ancestor of its greatness, the towering founding figure to whom very nearly everyone who came afterward wished somehow to be connected. And his name itself passed down into the languages of half of Europe to become the very word that those peoples use for a king. Later ages, hungry for heroes, took him up and made him over into legend, into the white-bearded emperor of 100 glittering romances and songs, the great lord of the famous paladins, the hero who would one day, some of them whispered, return again in his people's hour of greatest need. A later century even formally declared him a saint, though that, in truth, was far more a matter of the hard politics of long after his death than of any genuine holiness. And the Church does not truly hold him for a saint today. But the legend and the sainthood are, in a way, almost beside the real point. The real point is the idea of him, the idea of a single united Christian Europe gathered peacefully under one crowned and anointed head. An idea that he made real and solid for a few short shining decades, and that then went on to haunt the imagination of the continent for 1,000 long years after he was dust. And that in some quiet, stubborn, half-buried way haunts it still. Even now, even in our own time, they call him the Father of Europe. When you have followed all his life through, as we have tonight, it does not seem a foolish thing at all to call him. And there is one last strange afterlife worth the telling. Centuries after his death, a later ruler of Germany, wanting to wrap his own power in the glory of the emperor's name, had Charlemagne formally declared a saint, and for a long time, in the city of Aachen, and here and there beyond it, he was venerated as one, this man who had ordered the slaughter by the river and kept his daughters from marrying, and lived a life as full of hard worldly iron as of faith. The Church as a whole never truly embraced it, and does not hold him for a saint today, and perhaps that is just as well, for to file him away as a saint would be to lose the most interesting thing about him, which is precisely that he was not one, that he was a whole man, contradictory and enormous and real. But the very fact that a later age wished so badly to make him holy tells you how large he had grown in the memory of the world, how the centuries after him reached back, again and again, each in its own way and for its own purposes, to claim him, to be descended from him, to be like him, to borrow the borrowed light of his name. Conqueror, lawgiver, scholar's friend, father, saint and sinner both. The Father of Europe. He has been all of these things to the ages that came after, because he was, in his own single crowded lifetime, very nearly all of them at once. And so we have followed him now the long way, all of it, from the very beginning to the very end. From the uncertain morning of a birth whose very date is lost to us, through the cold, watchful rivalry of the two brothers and the bloody, grinding decades in the dark northern forests, over the high snowbound passes of the Alps, to the iron crown of the Lombards, and on into that terrible dark hour beside the river that no honest telling of his life can ever leave out or wish away. Through the gathering in of the gentle scholars and the slow raising of the great shining chapel, through the strange, warm, crowded court of the daughters he loved too much ever to let go. to the incense and the gold and the three great cries of that Christmas morning in Rome that made him an emperor, and on at the very last to the high fever and the failing painful breath and the quiet burial, on the same cold winter's day that he died, beneath the floor of the very church that he had built to be the beating heart of all the world. A man who could conquer whole kingdoms and could never learn to write his own name. A man who could give the order for terrible slaughter beside a river and weep real and bitter tears at the deaths of his sons. A man entirely of his own hard and distant age, neither the spotless saint that one later century wished to make of him, nor the simple monster that another age might prefer to paint him, but something altogether larger and stranger, and far more deeply and recognizably human than either of those easy pictures. A real man who lived a single real and crowded life, an enormous restless striving soul who reached out further into the world than very nearly anyone who has ever lived, and who lies now and has lain there quietly for 1200 long years, in the cool and the candlelight of his own chapel at Aachen, with the ancient marble of fallen Rome standing silent in the dark all around him, just exactly as he wished. And perhaps that, in the end, is the thing to carry down with you now into sleep, as the fire burns low and the hall grows quiet around us. Not the battles, and not the crown, and not the great map of the empire that came apart so soon after he was gone, but the smaller, truer image at the very centre of it all. An old man, the most powerful man in all the world, lying awake alone in the deep small hours of the night, in the flickering dark, patiently and clumsily and hopelessly, trying to teach his great scarred hand to form the shapes of the letters, reaching all his life for the one simple skill he could never quite grasp, and never, ever giving it up. There is more of the real Charlemagne in that one quiet image than in all his conquests put together. The reaching, the trying, the refusal, to the very end, to stop. Picture him there one more time before you let him go. The room is cold. The household sleeps in the black northern night. The fire has burned down to embers, and the only sound is the small scratch of a stylus on wax. Stopping, starting again. An old man who has ruled half a world, alone with the one task it never mastered him to master, bent over the letters like a boy at his lesson, hour after silent hour, asking nothing of anyone, simply trying, by the failing light, to learn. That is where I will leave him. Not on the throne, not in the basilica, not at the head of the army, but here, in the stillness, reaching for his letters, the most human thing in the whole of his enormous life. Wherever you are listening from tonight, in whatever city, in whatever country, at whatever quiet hour the clock beside you happens to show, thank you, from the bottom of my heart, for spending these few hours of the dark in the company of a man who has been 12 centuries gone from the world. If the evening has done its slow and gentle work upon you, if his far-off world came a little alive for you as the long night went on, then do think about subscribing, so that the next time the lamps are lit in the hall, you will be among the first to be called back into another time and another life and another evening like this one. And if you would leave just a word below before you drift off, to say where in the wide world you were when you listened. For there is something in that thought that I never tire of, the thought of so very many of us, scattered all over the turning earth, drawn quietly together into the same firelit hall on the same dark night. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.